Tonight, picture a long green river moving north through a great red desert, moving slowly and patiently in the last light of the day, so wide and so calm that the sky lies down upon its surface and floats there without a ripple. It is evening in a land that will one day be called Egypt, though no one has given it that name yet, and the sun is going down behind the western cliffs in a slow spill of amber and rose, and the water carries that colour on its back all the way to the sea. Along the banks the reeds stand tall and still, and the tall palms lean a little toward the water, and somewhere a heron lifts from the shallows on wide grey wings, and settles again a little further on. On the eastern shore, small houses of dried mud sit close together, their walls still warm from the day, and thin threads of smoke rise from little fires where the evening meal is cooking, and the smell of bread and river mud and dust hangs gently in the cooling air. Beyond the houses the fields are dark and rich, freshly watered, and beyond the fields the desert begins at once. Sudden and absolute, the green ending and the gold beginning, as if a line had been drawn by a careful hand. And far off to the south, catching the very last of the light, 3 great shapes of pale stone rise out of the sand against the darkening sky, enormous and silent and perfectly still, older even now than most of the story we are about to tell. Tonight we are going to sit beside this river, and we are going to watch, very slowly, as a scattering of small mud villages along its banks becomes the longest-lived civilization the world has ever known. A kingdom of pharaohs and pyramids and painted tombs that will rise and fall and rise again across 3,000 years, longer than the distance between us and the birth of Rome, longer than almost anything human hands have ever built. This is the entire story of ancient Egypt, the gift of the Nile, the land the Egyptians themselves simply called the Black Land, after the dark and fertile mud the river left behind each year, and we are going to walk through the whole of it, gently and without hurry, from the first farmers who chose to stay beside the water to the very last queen who ruled from a marble palace by the sea. So before we begin, settle yourself now into whatever stillness you have made for this hour. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether. Let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders 1 quiet inch at a time. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. There is nothing you need to carry into tomorrow. The river has been flowing for a very long time, and it will keep flowing whether or not you stay awake to hear about it. And so you are free, completely free, to let your eyes grow heavy and your breath grow slow, and to drift off whenever the drifting feels good. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through history, you are welcome to leave a gentle like on this video and to subscribe if you would like more of them, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only if it takes no effort at all. And if you feel like it, before you fall asleep, you might leave your location and your local time down in the comments, because it helps other sleepless people know they are not alone in the small hours. And it is a quiet kindness to strangers you will never meet. And now, let us go back, further than you might think, to a time before there were any pyramids at all, before there were kings, before there was even a river running quite where it runs today, to the very beginning of it all. Because before there was an Egypt, there was not yet a Nile as we would know it. And before there was a Nile, there was a very different Africa, wetter and greener and stranger than the desert we imagine now. If you could travel back to the land that would one day become the Sahara Desert, not 3,000 years ago but 10,000 or 12,000, you would not find an endless sea of sand. You would find grassland. You would find shallow lakes shining under the sun, and rivers running where there are now only dry valleys, and herds of wild cattle and gazelle moving across wide green plains under a sky heavy with rain in its season. This was the time we now call the African humid period, when the rains that now fall far to the south reached much further north, and the desert bloomed, and people lived scattered across a landscape that could feed them. They hunted the wild animals, and they gathered wild grains, and they moved with the seasons and the water, and for thousands of years this green world was their home. On the walls of caves and rock shelters deep in what is now the emptiest desert on earth, These people left their pictures, painted and carved into the stone, and the pictures show us swimmers. Small human figures with their arms and legs spread as if moving through water, in a place where today there has been no water to swim in for 6,000 years. They show cattle with long curving horns, and giraffes, and hunters with bows, and a whole living world that has since vanished so completely that when travellers first found those paintings they could scarcely believe them. But the green world did not last. Very slowly, over many centuries, the rains began to fail. The wet season grew shorter, and then shorter still. The lakes shrank and grew salty, and then dried to cracked white pans. The grass thinned, and the sand crept in at the edges, and the great herds moved away or died. And the people who had lived so freely across that wide land found their world closing in around them. And as the desert spread, the people were pushed, gently but relentlessly, toward the one place that still held water without fail, the one green thread running through all that growing gold, the river we now call the Nile. Imagine that slow gathering, over generations, families and small bands drifting toward the river because there was nowhere else left to go, arriving on its banks and finding, to their relief, that here at least the water never failed, that here the ground stayed dark and soft and could be made to grow things, that here a person could stay in one place and not starve. The Nile did something that almost no other river in the world does. Instead of flooding in a wild and unpredictable rush, it flooded gently and on a schedule, swelling every summer with the distant rains of far-off mountains none of these people had ever seen, rising over its banks in a slow brown tide spreading across the lowland, soaking the earth and laying down a fresh coat of rich black silt, and then, just as gently, drawing back again and leaving the fields ready to be planted. Year after year after year it did this, so reliably that a person could plan a life around it, could plant when the waters drew back and harvest before they rose again, could count on the river the way you count on the sun, and so people stayed. They built houses of mud brick, drying the river mud in the shape of bricks under the same fierce sun that had dried their old grasslands to dust, and they laid the bricks in courses and made walls and roofs, and the villages grew. They learned to sow barley and a kind of early wheat called emmer, and to keep cattle and sheep and goats and pigs and geese, and to fish the river with nets and traps and spears, and to snare the ducks that came in great clouds to the marshes. And along the whole thin length of the green valley, from the marshy delta where the river fanned out into many mouths and poured into the sea, all the way up the narrow ribbon of farmland hundreds of miles to the south, these villages multiplied and grew and slowly, without anyone deciding it, without anyone planning it, began to become something more than villages. Now I want you to hold in your mind the shape of this land, because the shape of it explains almost everything that follows. Egypt is not a wide and spreading country. It is long and thin, a green ribbon in a sea of desert, in most places only a few miles wide, the width of the land the river could reach and water. To the west lies desert, endless and empty. To the east lies desert too, and then the mountains, and then the sea. To the south the river comes down through a series of rocky rapids called cataracts, where the water breaks white over the stones and boats cannot easily pass. And to the north the river reaches the sea through the wide, marshy, many-channeled delta. So the land was protected on almost every side by emptiness, by desert and rock and water, and this meant that for very long stretches of its history Egypt could grow and prosper without the constant fear of invasion that troubled so many other places. It was a sheltered garden, walled about by wilderness, fed by a river that flooded like clockwork. And the Egyptians came to see themselves as a people set apart, living in the one ordered green place in a world of red chaos, and they made of that feeling a whole way of understanding the universe, an idea they called Mart, which meant order, and balance, and truth, and the right way of things, the way the world was supposed to be. Against Mart stood chaos, disorder, the desert, the foreigner, the flood that came too high or too low, and the whole labour of Egyptian kingship for 3,000 years would be understood as the endless task of holding back the chaos and keeping Ma'at in its place, of making sure the river rose and the sun climbed and the grain grew and the world kept turning as it should. But all of that lay in the future. For now there were only the villages spreading along the river, and slowly over many centuries they began to draw together into larger groupings, into little chiefdoms and territories, each with its own leader, its own gods, its own patch of the valley. And two great regions began to take shape, two Egypts that would one day be joined but that for now grew separately, each with its own character and its own crown. In the south, up the long narrow valley, was the land they called Upper Egypt, upper because it lay upriver, higher along the Nile's course, a place of narrow farmland pressed between the desert cliffs, tough and conservative and proud. And in the north, where the river opened out into the broad green fan of the delta, was Lower Egypt, lower because it lay downriver, nearer the sea, a wider and flatter and more open land. The people of the south wore a tall white crown, and the people of the north a red one, and though they shared a river and a language and much else besides, they were not yet one people, and the joining of them, when it came, would be remembered as the very first great event in Egyptian history, the moment the story truly begins. Before we come to that joining, though, let us linger a little longer in these early centuries, in the time we now call the predynastic period, the long slow morning before the kingdom, because it was here, quietly and without fanfare, that almost everything the Egyptians would later become was first invented. In the south especially, in a stretch of the valley around a place we now call Nakada, the villages were growing into towns, and the towns were growing rich, and the people were becoming very skilled. They learned to make pottery of great beauty, red vessels with black tops, and later pale jars painted with boats and ostriches and spiral patterns, and they made these in such numbers and to such a standard that we can trace the whole rise of their culture just by watching their pots change over the years. They learned to work stone with astonishing patience, hollowing out hard stone into thin-walled vases so perfect and so difficult to make that modern craftsman, with modern tools, can scarcely reproduce them. They mined gold from the eastern desert, and they traded for cedar wood from the far-off coast of what is now Lebanon, and for lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone that came, incredibly, all the way from the mountains of Afghanistan, passed hand to hand across the whole width of the ancient world to end up as beads in an Egyptian grave. And they buried their dead with great care, in pits at the edge of the desert, curled on their sides as if sleeping, surrounded by pots and tools and beads and little carved figures facing the setting sun, and something remarkable happened to those bodies in the hot, dry sand. The sand drew the moisture out of them and preserved them, skin and hair and all, so that the dead did not rot but dried and endured, and it may be that the Egyptians, digging occasionally into older graves, saw these preserved bodies and drew from them a great and fateful idea, the idea that the body could last, that death need not be the end of the flesh, that if only the body could be kept whole, then something of the person might endure. That idea, born perhaps from a chance of the desert sand, would grow over the centuries into the whole vast Egyptian science of mummification and tombs and the afterlife, into pyramids and painted burial chambers and golden coffins, into one of the deepest and most elaborate concerns any human culture has ever had with the fate of the dead. But that too lay in the future. For now the towns of the south grew stronger and richer, and their chiefs grew more powerful, and slowly the many little territories were swallowed up by the few, and the few by the fewer, until at last the whole of the south, the whole of Upper Egypt, came under the rule of a single line of kings based at a city we call Hierakonpolis, the city of the hawk, whose god was a fierce falcon named Horus. And these southern kings, tough and ambitious and hungry for more, turned their eyes north toward the wide rich delta toward Lower Egypt, and set about the long work of bringing the whole valley, from the first cataract to the sea, under a single crown. We do not know the true story of how it happened, whether by war or marriage or slow absorption or all three across many reigns, because it happened before writing had quite been invented, in the grey borderland between legend and history. But the Egyptians themselves remembered it as the work of one man, a southern king they called Menes, the founder, the uniter, the first true pharaoh, the one who joined the two lands and set the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north together on a single head. And there survives from just this moment one of the most extraordinary objects in all of history. A flat plate of dark green stone, carved on both sides, about the size of a large book, made to grind the pigment for a god's eye paint, and now called the Nama palette, after the king whose name is carved upon it, a king many scholars think was the real man behind the legend of Menes. On one side of the palette a tall king wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and raises a mace to strike down a kneeling enemy, and on the other side the same king, now wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, walks in procession past the beheaded bodies of his foes. And between these two scenes, in these two crowns worn by one man, we are watching, carved in stone more than 5,000 years ago, the very birth of the United Kingdom of Egypt. It is one of the oldest historical documents in the world, and it says, as plainly as stone can say anything, the two lands are one, and I am their king. With that joining, around 3,100 years before the birth of Christ, we cross the line from the shadowy predynastic world into recorded history, into the long parade of dynasties that the Egyptians and later historians would count off, one after another, all the way down the centuries. The kings of this first great age set up a new capital at the very hinge of the two lands, at the place where the narrow southern valley opens into the northern delta, at a white-walled city they called Memphis, which would remain one of the great cities of Egypt for thousands of years. And in these early dynasties, the first and the second, over several centuries, the young kingdom put down its roots. Writing developed from a handful of signs into a true system, the beautiful picture writing we call hieroglyphs, in which a little owl or a folded cloth, or a reed or a mouth, each carried sound and meaning, and with writing came records, and accounts, and the naming of years, and the whole apparatus of a state that could count its grain, and tax its people, and remember its kings. The office of kingship itself took on the shape it would keep for 3,000 years. The king was not merely a ruler, but a living link between the human world and the divine, the earthly embodiment of the falcon god Horus, the one man responsible for maintaining Mart, for keeping the cosmos in order, for making sure through his rituals and his righteousness that the river rose and the sun returned and the world did not slide back into chaos. It was an enormous burden to lay on a single pair of shoulders, and the Egyptians surrounded the king with ceremony and secrecy and awe to help him bear it, and they buried their early kings in great tombs of mud brick at a desert site called Abydos, sacred to the god of the dead, tombs surrounded, in the very earliest days, by the graves of servants who seem to have been sent to death to accompany their king, a grim custom that Egypt, to its credit, gave up fairly quickly, replacing the sacrificed servants with little models and figurines, which suited everyone rather better. And so the kingdom grew, and steadied, and gathered its strength, until a few centuries after the unification, it was ready to do something that the world had never seen before, something so ambitious and so strange that it still stops people in their tracks 4,500 years later, something that would come to stand, in the mind of all the world, as the very symbol of Egypt itself. The age of the pyramids was about to begin. We come now to the age the Egyptians themselves would look back on, thousands of years later, as their golden dawn, the time we call the Old Kingdom, the age of the great pyramid builders, and it begins, as so many great things do, with one man having one very good idea. That man was named Imhotep, and he was not a king. He was the chief minister and architect and, it seems, the physician and the sage of a king named Djoser, who ruled in the age we call the Third Dynasty, around 2,700 years before the birth of Christ. Now, for centuries, the kings of Egypt had been buried under low, flat-topped rectangular tombs of mud brick, called mastabas, from the Arabic word for the low mud benches that they resemble, a bench for a house, a bench for a tomb. And Imhotep, charged with building a tomb worthy of his king, looked at the low mud bench that a royal tomb had always been, and did something that no one had ever done before. Instead of one mastaba, he built a mastaba of stone, cut and shaped from the desert itself, and then, when that was done, he built a smaller one on top of it, and a smaller one on top of that, and again, 6 great steps of stone rising one upon another, until the whole thing climbed more than 200 feet into the desert sky. A vast stairway of pale limestone, standing over the plain at a place called Saqqara, near the capital at Memphis. It was the first large building of cut stone anywhere in the world. Nothing so tall, so heavy, so permanent, had ever been raised by human hands. Where the villagers built in mud that melted back into the earth in a generation, here was a thing built to defy time itself, to stand forever, a stairway, some think, for the dead king to climb into the sky and join the everlasting stars. And it worked. It is still standing, 4,700 years later, the oldest great stone monument on earth, and around it Imhotep laid out a whole complex of courtyards and shrines and chapels in stone, an entire architecture invented more or less at a stroke. The Egyptians never forgot Imhotep. 2,000 years after his death, they were still worshipping him as a god of wisdom and healing, one of the very few commoners ever raised to the ranks of the gods, and it is a rare and pleasing thing, in the long grim record of ancient monuments raised by forgotten hands, to be able to name the architect and know that his own people loved him for it. But the step pyramid was only the beginning. Once the idea of building a mountain of stone for a dead king had taken hold, the kings of Egypt seized upon it with an ambition that verged on obsession, and over the following century they refined and enlarged and perfected it with a speed that still astonishes. The great leap came under a king named Sneferu, the founder of the 4th dynasty, who was, by any measure, the most prolific pyramid builder who ever lived, a man who did not build one pyramid, but 3, and in doing so worked out, by trial and by error and by sheer stubborn effort, how to build a true smooth-sided pyramid, the shape we all now carry in our minds. His first attempt, at a site called Medum, seems to have begun as a step pyramid, and then been filled in and cased to make its sides smooth, and at some point, either during building or long after, much of its outer casing collapsed and slid down into a great skirt of rubble around its base, so that today it stands as a strange tower-like core rising out of a hill of its own debris, a noble failure, or a partial one, from which a great deal was learned. His second attempt at a place called Darsha is the one we call the Bent Pyramid, and it is my own favourite of all the pyramids, because it wears its mistake so honestly. The builders began raising its sides at a steep angle, a bold and confident slope, and then, more than halfway up, something went wrong. Some cracking or settling in the structure frightened them, and they changed the angle sharply to something shallower and safer, so that the whole pyramid bends partway up, steep below and gentle above. Like a thought that lost its nerve, it stands there still in the desert south of Memphis, honest and slightly awkward, a monument to the moment a group of engineers realized, 4,500 years ago, that they had been a little too ambitious, and quietly corrected course. And then, having learned from the tower that slid and the pyramid that bent, Sneferu's builders got it right. His third pyramid, also at Darsha, is the one we call the Red Pyramid, after the reddish stone of its core, and it is a true smooth-sided pyramid, the first ever completed, rising at a gentle and confident angle to a clean point against the sky. Between them, Sneferu's 3 pyramids moved more stone than almost any king who came after him, and by the time he died his masons and engineers and work gangs had turned pyramid building from a wild experiment into a mature and confident craft. They had learned how to quarry and move and lay millions of tons of stone, how to organize tens of thousands of workers, how to feed and house and manage an army of labour, how to survey a perfectly square base and raise 4 triangular faces to meet at a single point in the sky. Everything was ready. And so Snefru passed his kingdom and his experience and his superbly trained workforce to his son. And his son took all of it, all that hard-won skill, and used it to build the single most famous building in the history of the human race. The son's name was Khufu, and his monument is the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is very hard, standing before it, or even looking at a photograph of it, to take in what the Great Pyramid actually is, because it is so familiar that we have stopped seeing it, and because its scale defeats the ordinary machinery of the mind. So let me give you a few plain numbers, spoken slowly, to hold in the dark. It was built of somewhere around 2,300,000 blocks of stone, each one weighing on average around 2.5 tons, some of them far more, cut and dragged and lifted and set in place one after another after another. When it was finished, it stood 480 feet high, and it remained the tallest structure made by human beings anywhere on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until the cathedral builders of medieval Europe finally outtopped it. Its base is very nearly a perfect square, each side running about 750 feet, and the 4 sides are aligned almost exactly to the 4 points of the compass, to north and south and east and west, with an accuracy that would be difficult to match today and difficult to explain even now, in a time before the compass, before the telescope, before any of the instruments we would think necessary for such a thing. The whole vast structure was originally sheathed in a smooth outer casing of fine white limestone, polished until it shone. So that the finished pyramid was not the rough brown stepped mountain we see today, but a blinding, gleaming, geometrically perfect mountain of white, catching the sun so fiercely that it could be seen from far down the river, a made thing, a human thing, standing in the desert and rivaling the works of the gods. And it was raised, as far as we can tell, in the space of a single reign, perhaps 20 years, by a workforce not of slaves as the old stories had it, but of tens of thousands of ordinary Egyptians, farmers and labourers organised into gangs with cheerful names, well fed on bread and beer and meat, housed in a whole temporary city built for the purpose, tending the greatest building project the world had ever seen as a kind of vast national service, a gift of labour to their god-king that would secure the order of the cosmos and, not incidentally, feed and employ the whole valley through the months when the Nile flood covered the fields and there was no farming to be done. How they lifted the stones we still argue about, whether by long straight ramps or spiralling ones or ramps built inside the structure itself, and the honest truth is that we do not fully know. And there is something rather wonderful in that the most famous building in the world still keeps a few of its secrets. But lift them they did, and set them true. And when Khufu died, he was laid to rest in a chamber of red granite deep within the mountain of stone, and his son Khafre built the second great pyramid at Giza beside his father's, very nearly as tall, and standing on slightly higher ground so that it looks to the casual eye even taller. And it was Khafre, most believe, who also set beside his pyramid the strangest and most haunting of all the Giza monuments, the Great Sphinx, a vast lion's body with a human head, the head most likely a portrait of the king himself, carved from a single great outcrop of living rock left standing in the quarry, gazing east toward the rising sun, wearing the royal headcloth, silent, patient, its nose long since lost to the centuries. It has crouched there for 4,500 years, watching the sun come up over the desert every single morning, and it has become, along with the pyramids behind it, one of the truest symbols of Egypt in all the world. And then Khafre's successor, Menkaure, built the third and smallest of the Giza pyramids. And with that the great burst was more or less over. Never again would Egypt build on quite this scale. The 3 pyramids of Giza, and the Sphinx keeping watch before them, stand at the very summit of the Old Kingdom's confidence and power. A moment when a young civilization, flush with the wealth of the river and the certainty of its faith, reached up and built mountains. And it is those 3 pale shapes, you will remember, that we saw at the very beginning of our story, rising against the darkening sky at the far southern edge of our evening river, older even then than most of the tale, and now, having walked all this way, we know how they came to be there. But a civilization cannot live forever at the summit of its own confidence, and the very effort of building those mountains carried within it the seeds of change. After the pyramid builders of the 4th dynasty came the kings of the 5th and the 6th, and their pyramids grew smaller and more hastily built, cores of rubble faced with stone that have slumped now into shapeless mounds, because the wealth and the labour that had gone into the great pyramids were being spent in other ways. The kings began to share their glory and their resources with the priesthoods of the gods, above all with the priests of the sun god Ra at a city called Heliopolis, whose worship rose to dominate the age, so that later kings called themselves the sons of Ra and built temples to the sun open to the sky. And it is in the pyramids of these later kings, at Saqqara, that something new and wonderful appears, carved in column after column down the walls of the burial chambers, the oldest religious writings in the world, the spells and prayers and incantations we now call the pyramid texts, meant to guide and protect the dead king on his journey through the sky and the underworld to join the gods. Full of strange and beautiful images of the king climbing to heaven on a ladder of sunlight, or being ferried across the sky by a divine boatman, or rising, transfigured, to sail forever with the stars that never set. For the first time we can hear, in their own words, what the Egyptians hoped for beyond death. And it is not oblivion they hoped for, but continuation, a life beyond life, lived among the gods in a land of reeds and water and endless harvest. But even as these prayers were carved, the earthly kingdom was quietly weakening. The kings, to reward their officials, had given away land and offices and, worse, had made those offices hereditary, so that powerful families in the provinces, the governors we call nomarchs after the nomes or districts they ruled, began to build up their own local power, their own local loyalty, their own fine tombs cut into the cliffs of their home districts, until they were kings in all but name in their own little corners of the valley. And over all of this hung the reign of one man, Pepi II, who came to the throne as a small child and, according to the tradition, ruled for somewhere close to 90 years, the longest reign attributed to any monarch in all of history. And while a long reign might sound like stability, a king who outlives his own sons and grandsons, who dwindles at last into an ancient figure presiding over a court he can no longer truly command, is a recipe not for strength, but for slow decay. And then, at the worst possible moment, the river itself seems to have turned against Egypt. Far away, the same great shifts of climate that had once dried the green Sahara now weakened the monsoon rains that fed the Nile, and for a run of years the flood came too low, and the fields went unwatered, and the harvests failed, and famine crept into the valley. A god-king's whole promise to his people was that he would keep Ma'at, keep the order of the world, make the river rise, and now the river would not rise, and the promise was broken, and with it broke the spell of unquestioned royal power that had held Egypt together for 500 years, and so the Old Kingdom did not so much fall as dissolve, the central government fading. The great pyramids left behind like the shells of a vanished confidence, the country breaking apart into its provinces, each nomarch fending for his own people, rival lines of kings claiming the throne from different cities. And for something like 150 years Egypt passed through the troubled age we call the First Intermediate Period, the first great gap in the long story, a time the Egyptians themselves remembered with horror as a world turned upside down. We have from this time, or from just after it, strange and haunting texts of lament, in which a scribe wails that the poor have become rich and the rich poor, that robbers walk the roads, that the river is blood, that a man goes out to plough with his shield on his back, that the things that never change have changed. Whether these texts describe real events or a kind of nightmare of disorder, they tell us how deeply the Egyptians feared chaos, how precious and how fragile order seemed to them once they had seen it fail. And yet, and this is the great lesson of Egyptian history, the country did not die. The valley was still there, and the river, though it faltered, still flowed, and the people still farmed its banks, and slowly, out of the wreckage, new powers began to rise and to gather the pieces. Two great centres emerged, one in the north around a city called Heracleopolis, and one in the south around a city that would become one of the most magnificent in the ancient world. A place the Egyptians called Waset and the Greeks would later call Thebes. And the princes of Thebes, tough southern lords, set themselves to do again what Narmer had done more than 1,000 years before, to conquer their rivals and reunite the two lands under a single crown. After long years of war up and down the valley, a Theban king named Mentuhotep II, one of the great and under-remembered figures of Egyptian history, at last defeated the northern kings and brought the whole country back under one rule, around 2,050 years before the birth of Christ. And with that reunification, Egypt entered its second great age, the age we call the Middle Kingdom. If the Old Kingdom was Egypt's confident youth, all soaring ambition and mountains of stone, the Middle Kingdom was its thoughtful maturity, an age that had known suffering and collapse, and had come out the other side wiser, more careful, more humane. Mentuhotep built himself a strange and beautiful terraced funerary temple against the cliffs on the west bank at Thebes, a design unlike anything before it, and his successors moved the capital back north to a new city near the old heartland to keep a firmer hand on the whole country. And there arose a new line of powerful kings, most of them named either Amenemhat or Senusret, the 12th dynasty, who ruled Egypt for nearly 200 years and made it prosperous and strong and orderly once again. These were practical men. Rather than pour the nation's wealth into a single enormous tomb, they set about improving the country itself. In a great natural depression to the west of the river, a region called the Fayum, where a branch of the Nile spilled into a large lake, they carried out vast works of drainage and irrigation, digging canals and raising embankments to control the water and reclaim tens of thousands of acres of rich new farmland, turning a marshy hollow into one of the most fertile regions in all of Egypt. A piece of quiet, patient, useful engineering worth more to the ordinary people than any pyramid. They pushed the southern border far up the Nile into Nubia, the gold-rich land above the cataracts, and secured it with a chain of massive mud-brick fortresses, great frowning strongholds with towers and ramparts and dry moats, guarding the trade routes by which the gold and ebony and ivory and incense of the south came flowing north into Egypt. They reformed the government, curbing the power of the over-mighty provincial nomarchs who had helped tear the Old Kingdom apart, and drawing power back toward the throne. And they presided over what many consider the golden age of Egyptian language and literature, the age whose polished, elegant Middle Egyptian would be studied and copied by schoolboys as the classical tongue for the next 1,500 years, the way we might study Latin. It was in this age that the great tales were written down, the story of Sinui, an Egyptian official who flees the country in a panic on the death of his king and lives long years in exile among the wandering peoples of the East, growing rich and powerful there, and yet aching all the while for home, for the land of the river, until at last a new king pardons him and calls him back to die and be buried in Egypt as he has always longed to be. A story about homesickness and belonging, and the pull of one's own country that feels as fresh and as true today as it did 4,000 years ago. It was a confident, literate, well-governed age, and it might have gone on for centuries. But the Middle Kingdom, like the old before it, would come at last to its own slow ending, and this time the danger would come not from within, from a failing river or a fading king, but from without, from beyond the sheltering deserts, from a people the Egyptians had never had to reckon with before, who would do something no one had ever done, and seize the throne of Egypt itself. Over the long years of the Middle Kingdom, peoples from the lands to the northeast, from Canaan and the wider Near East, had been drifting into Egypt, especially into the wide and open delta, some as traders, some as workers, some as settlers, until in the eastern delta there were whole towns of these foreigners, with their own gods and their own customs and their own ways. The Egyptians called them, roughly, the rulers of foreign lands, a phrase that comes down to us through Greek as the Hyksos. And as the Middle Kingdom's central power weakened once again, in the way that Egyptian central power seemed fated periodically to weaken, these settlers in the delta grew strong enough to set up a kingdom of their own, with their capital at a city called Avaris. and to rule the whole of Lower Egypt as kings in their own right, while the old Egyptian line clung on in the south at Thebes, reduced and resentful and paying tribute. For the first time in its long history, Egypt, the sheltered garden, the land the gods had walled about with desert, was ruled in part by foreigners, and the Egyptians never forgot the shock and the shame of it. And yet, as so often in history, the humiliation carried gifts inside it. The Hyksos brought with them the new technologies of the wider Bronze Age world, things Egypt in its long isolation had missed, and above all they brought the horse and the chariot, that light, fast, two-wheeled fighting platform that was even then transforming warfare across the whole of the ancient Near East. And they brought better bronze working, and the powerful composite bow, and new kinds of weapons and armour. The southern kings at Thebes, chafing under their humiliation, studied these new weapons, adopted them, mastered them, and then turned them against the very people who had brought them. A line of fierce Theban warrior kings began the War of Liberation, and after long and bitter fighting, a king named Amose at last stormed the Hyksos capital at Avaris, drove the foreign kings out of Egypt entirely, pursued them into Canaan to make sure they could not return, and reunited the two lands once more under a single native crown, around 1,550 years before the birth of Christ. And with that victory Egypt entered the third and the most dazzling of its great ages, the New Kingdom, the Age of Empire, the age of the pharaohs whose names still ring down the centuries, Hatshepsut and Thutmose, Amenhotep and Akhenaten, Tutankhamun and Rameses, the age of the Valley of the Kings, and the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, the age when Egypt was not merely a rich and orderly kingdom minding its own long river, but the greatest power in the world. For the war against the Hyksos had changed Egypt's very idea of itself, having been invaded, having learned to its cost that the desert walls were not impassable after all. That danger could come from beyond the borders. Egypt resolved never to be caught so again, and its new kings built a professional standing army, with regiments of chariots and companies of archers and spearmen, and they marched it out beyond the old frontiers, not to conquer for conquest's sake at first, but to push the danger as far from Egypt as possible, to control the lands to the northeast through which any future invader would have to come, and in doing so, they built an empire. Egyptian armies marched up through Canaan and Syria, taking the cities of the Levant one by one, and far up the Nile deep into Nubia, until the writ of the pharaoh ran from the great bend of the Euphrates River in the north to well beyond the Fourth Cataract in the south, an empire stretching well over 1,000 miles, and the wealth of all these lands. The tribute and the trade and the plunder and the taxes, the gold of Nubia and the cedar of Lebanon, and the silver and horses of the north and the incense of the far south, came flooding into Egypt in a river of riches such as the country had never known, and the kings poured that wealth, above all, into the worship of the god who they believed had given them their victories, the great god of Thebes, Amun, Amun-Ra, the hidden one, the king of the gods. And so we come to the temples. If the symbol of the Old Kingdom is the pyramid, a mountain of stone sealing a dead king away forever, the symbol of the New Kingdom is the temple, vast and living and open, above all the immense temple of Amun at Karnak, on the east bank at Thebes, which every king of the empire enlarged and adorned and added to, each trying to outdo his predecessors, over 500 years, until it grew into the largest religious building ever raised by human beings, a whole city of stone, of towering gateways called pylons, of courts and sanctuaries and sacred lakes, of avenues lined with ram-headed sphinxes, and above all of the great hypostyle hall, a forest of 134 gigantic stone columns, some of them so vast that 100 people could stand together on the top of a single one, their capitals carved like the open flowers of the papyrus and the closed buds of the lotus, painted in brilliant blues and reds and yellows and greens, the whole roofed over so that the worshipper passing through moved from bright sunlight into a cool and towering green gloom shot through, with shafts of light from high windows, like walking through a stone forest at the dawn of the world. It survives, much of it, still standing, and to walk through it even now, even roofless and faded, is one of the great experiences the ancient world can still offer. And the kings no longer built pyramids for their tombs, because a pyramid, for all its grandeur, is really nothing but an enormous signpost reading, "Here is a dead king with his treasure, please rob me," and robbed they nearly all had been. So the New Kingdom pharaohs did the opposite. Across the river from Thebes, on the west bank where the sun went down, in a remote and desolate valley behind the cliffs, guarded and hidden, they cut their tombs deep into the living rock, long sloping corridors and stairways plunging down into the mountain to hidden burial chambers. And over the entrances they piled rubble to hide them, and they set guards, and they hoped. And this is the place we now call the Valley of the Kings, where for 500 years the greatest pharaohs of Egypt were laid to rest in secret, their walls painted with the whole map of the underworld and the journey of the sun through the 12 hours of the night. It did not, in the end, save most of them from the robbers either, but it did save one, as we shall see, and that one has told us more than all the rest. Now, among the very first of these New Kingdom monarchs there arose one of the most remarkable figures in the whole of Egyptian history, and one of the most remarkable in the history of the ancient world, because she was a woman who made herself a king. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she was the daughter of one pharaoh and the wife of the next, her own half-brother, in the way of Egyptian royalty, and when her husband died leaving only an infant son by another woman, Hatshepsut stepped in to rule as regent for the child, as many royal women had done before. But Hatshepsut did not stop at regent. Over a few years she took, one by one, all the titles and all the powers and all the trappings of a full pharaoh, and had herself crowned as king, not queen but king, and ruled Egypt in her own right for around 20 years, one of the longest and most prosperous and most peaceful reigns of the whole New Kingdom. She was careful and she was clever, and she knew that a female pharaoh was a thing that strained against the very idea of Ma'at, of the proper order of the world. And so in her official images she had herself shown in the full regalia of a male king, with the royal kilt and the false ceremonial beard, not because anyone was fooled, but because the office of king was so bound up with its ancient symbols that to be king was to wear them. She justified her rule with a splendid story carved on her temple walls, that the great god Amun himself had been her true father, that he had come to her mother and fathered her, and that she had been destined for the throne from before her birth, and rather than spend her long reign at war, she spent it building and trading and enriching Egypt. Her greatest monument is her funerary temple at a place called Deir el-Bahari on the west bank at Thebes, rising in 3 great colonnaded terraces against the sheer honey-coloured cliffs behind it, so perfectly suited to its setting that it looks less like a thing built than a thing grown out of the rock, and it is, by common agreement, one of the most beautiful buildings surviving from the ancient world. On its walls she recorded the achievement she was proudest of, not a battle, but a voyage, a great trading expedition she sent far down the Red Sea to a rich and distant land called Punt, somewhere on the coast of the Horn of Africa, and the reliefs show the Egyptian ships with their sails and oars, and the strange round houses of Punt raised on stilts, and the people and the animals of that far country, and above all the treasures the expedition brought home. Gold and ebony and ivory and apes and exotic animals, and most precious of all, whole living incense trees, dug up and carried in baskets all the way back to Egypt to be planted in the god's garden, their roots still remembered, faintly, in the dry hollows before her temple where they once grew. When Hatshepsut at last died, after her 20 peaceful and prosperous years, the throne passed to the boy she had ruled in place of, now grown into a man, her stepson and nephew Thutmose III, and he turned out to be one of the greatest warrior kings the world has ever seen, a general so brilliant and so relentless that later historians would call him the Napoleon of the ancient world, though it would be fairer to the ancient man to call the modern one the Thutmose of the newer world. For while Hatshepsut had ruled, the cities of Syria and Canaan, sensing perhaps that a woman on the throne of Egypt meant a slackening of the imperial grip, had gathered themselves into a great coalition to throw off Egyptian control. And Thutmose, in the very first year of his sole reign, marched out at the head of his army to bring them to heel, and he did it with a boldness that took everyone, including his own cautious generals, by surprise. The rebel army lay waiting for him near a city called Megiddo, guarding the passes through a range of hills, expecting the Egyptians to come by one of the two safe and easy roads. Thutmose, against all the advice of his officers, chose instead the third road, a narrow and dangerous track through a gorge so tight that the army had to go through in single file, horse by horse and man by man, strung out and helpless, where a handful of defenders could have destroyed them. But the enemy, certain no sane commander would take such a risk, had left it unguarded, and the Egyptian army poured out of the hills exactly where it was least expected, and fell upon the astonished coalition and scattered it. The whole thing was recorded in detail on the walls of Karnak, the first battle in all of human history of which we have a real blow-by-blow account, and it has been studied by soldiers ever since. Only one thing marred the victory, and it is a very human detail, the kind that makes the ancient world suddenly real. Having broken the enemy army in the field, the Egyptian soldiers, instead of pressing on into the undefended city, stopped to strip the dead and plunder the abandoned camp, and by the time they finally turned to the city, its gates were shut, and its defenders had hauled the fleeing survivors up over the walls on ropes made of knotted clothing. And Thutmose was forced to settle down to a siege of 7 long months instead of walking straight in, all because his men could not resist the loot, which is a habit that has cost commanders their easy victories in every age since. But take it he did, in the end, and over the next 20 years Thutmose III marched into Syria again and again, 17 campaigns in all, pushing the empire to its greatest extent, all the way to the great river Euphrates in the far north, where he set up a monument boasting that he had reached the limits of the world, and hunting elephants on the way home for good measure. He was not merely a destroyer. He took the sons of the conquered kings back to Egypt to be raised at the Egyptian court, so that they grew up half Egyptian, loyal to the pharaoh, and returned in time to rule their own cities as faithful vassals, a policy far cleverer and more lasting than mere terror. And the tribute of his conquests made Egypt richer than it had ever been. Yet after his death, Thutmose III did a strange and troubling thing, or someone in his name did, for late in his reign, the images and the names of Hatshepsut. The stepmother who had ruled before him began to be chiselled off the monuments, her statues smashed and buried, her name hacked out of the king lists, as though there were an effort to erase her from history altogether, to pretend that the throne had passed directly from her husband to her stepson, with no woman king in between. Why it was done, and whether from resentment or from a later rising anxiety about the very idea of a female pharaoh disturbing the proper order of things, we do not truly know, and it is one of the quiet mysteries of Egyptian history. But it did not in the end succeed. The erasers missed enough, in enough high and hidden places, that we have been able to piece her back together. To restore to Hatshepsut her 20 splendid years, and there is a kind of justice in that the woman someone tried so hard to forget is now among the most famous pharaohs of them all. The empire that Thutmose built reached its serene and glittering height a few reigns later, under a king named Amenhotep III, who inherited a world at peace, an empire so secure and so respected that he barely needed to lift a sword in his whole long reign, and who spent nearly 40 years simply enjoying and displaying the almost unimaginable wealth of Egypt at its zenith. His reign was the great age of Egyptian art and luxury and diplomacy, when the pharaoh sat at the centre of a web of correspondence with all the other great kings of the age, the kings of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni and the Hittites, letters written on clay tablets in the diplomatic language of the day, many of which survive, in which these mighty monarchs address one another as brothers, and haggle over gold and gifts and the exchange of royal brides, and complain, in tones any modern reader would recognise, that the gifts they were sent were not as fine as they had been promised, and that in Egypt everyone knew gold was as common as dust. Amenhotep built on a colossal scale, temples and palaces and a vast pleasure lake for his queen, and set up 2 enormous seated statues of himself to guard his funerary temple, statues so huge that though the temple behind them has almost entirely vanished, the 2 giants still sit there on the plain, weathered and cracked. The ones the later Greeks called the Colossi of Memnon, and came from far away to marvel at. And beside him through all of this sat his queen, a commoner by birth, a woman of evident intelligence and force named Ta, whom he honoured as no Egyptian king had honoured a wife before, showing her at his own scale, naming her in his official inscriptions, listening, it seems, to her counsel. And it was the son of Amenhotep and Ta who would come to the throne next, and who would take the serene and golden and supremely confident Egypt his father had left him, the richest and most powerful and most conservative kingdom in the world, and try, almost single-handedly, to tear its entire ancient religion up by the roots and remake it around a single god, in the strangest and most extraordinary episode in the whole 3,000 years of Egyptian history. His name at first was Amenhotep, like his father, but he would change it, and himself, and for a brief and shining and troubled moment, all of Egypt with him. For 3,000 years the religion of Egypt was one of the most crowded and colourful and generous in all the world, a vast and tangled family of gods, hundreds of them, great and small, national and local, gods with the heads of falcons and jackals and cats and crocodiles and ibises, gods of the sun and the moon and the flood and the harvest, gods of birth and death and writing and beer and childbirth and the household, a religion that had grown for millennia by simply absorbing every new god it met rather than casting the old ones out, so that the same god might have 3 names and 4 forms and a dozen local shrines, and nobody found this in the least confusing, because the divine, for the Egyptian, was not a single sharp thing but a great warm crowd. Above them all in the new kingdom towered Amun the Hidden One, the great god of Thebes, whose priests had grown, on the wealth of the empire, into perhaps the richest and most powerful institution in the country. An entrenched establishment controlling vast lands and treasuries and thousands of people. A power that could stand, if it chose, almost as an equal beside the throne itself. And into this ancient, crowded, comfortable religious world came the son of Amenhotep III, a young man who looked at all of it, all the hundreds of gods and the powerful priests, and the whole immemorial apparatus of Egyptian faith, and decided that nearly the whole of it was wrong. He began his reign conventionally enough, as Amenhotep IV. But within a few years he had fixed upon a single deity, an aspect of the sun that had always existed quietly in the Egyptian mind, not the falcon-headed sun god of the old myths, but the visible disk of the sun itself, the physical thing in the sky that gave light and warmth and life, which the Egyptians called the Aten, and he came to believe, or to insist, that the Aten was not merely one god among many, but the only god, the sole creator and sustainer of all life, and that all the others, all the crowded warm multitude of the old religion, were false and must be swept away. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is content, to Akhenaten, which meant something like he who is effective for the Aten, or the living spirit of the Aten, cutting the hated name of the old great god right out of his own. And then he did the truly astonishing thing. He abandoned Thebes, the ancient city of Amun, and he abandoned Memphis, and he ordered built, on a virgin site halfway between them, on a wide bay of desert against the eastern cliffs where no god had ever been worshipped before, an entire new capital city from nothing, a holy city for the Aten, which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and which we now call, after the modern village nearby, Amarna, and there, in the space of a few years, rose a whole gleaming city of temples and palaces and villas and workshops and wide ceremonial roads, its temples unlike any before them, open to the sky, roofless, so that the worshipper stood directly under the rays of the god instead of in the towering green gloom of the old covered sanctuaries. Because the god now was the light itself, and needed no roof between it and its people, and the king moved his whole court there, and declared that he would never leave, and marked out the boundaries of his sacred city with great inscribed stones, and settled down with his queen and his daughters to worship the sun. And what a queen she was! Her name was Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one has come, and she stood beside Akhenaten in his revolution, not as a mere consort, but as something close to a partner and a fellow priest, shown again and again on the monuments at a scale and with a prominence granted to almost no queen before her, worshipping the Aten alongside her husband, riding in her own chariot even in some scenes. In the pose reserved for the king smiting his enemies, as though she shared in the very kingship itself. And her face has become, by a strange accident, one of the most famous faces in all of human history, because in the ruins of a sculptor's workshop at Amarna there was found, thousands of years later, a painted limestone bust of her, unfinished, left behind, a model for other portraits, showing her with her long graceful neck and her serene half-smile, and her tall flat-topped blue crown, so lifelike and so lovely that she seems about to speak. And that single sculptor's model, made as a workshop reference and never meant to be seen, is now perhaps the single most recognised image of ancient Egypt, after the mask of Tutankhamun and the Sphinx itself. The art of Akhenaten's reign broke as sharply from tradition as his religion did. For 3,000 years Egyptian art had shown the human body according to a fixed and idealised formula, timeless and serene and perfect. Now, suddenly, the royal family was shown in a strange new style, exaggerated and almost caricatured, with long thin necks and heavy hips and swollen bellies and drooping faces and spidery fingers, and, most startling of all, shown in moments of tender ordinary intimacy that no pharaoh had ever permitted before, the king and queen sitting together with their little daughters climbing over their laps, kissing them, playing with them, mourning together over a dead child, a warmth and a domesticity and a humanity utterly foreign to the frozen majesty of every reign before. And over all of it, in scene after scene, hangs the disk of the Aten in the sky, its rays reaching down and ending in dozens of tiny human hands. Each little hand offering the sign of life to the king and his family, the sun reaching down to touch its chosen ones. It is one of the most beautiful and one of the most peculiar bodies of art the ancient world produced, and it lasted, like everything else about this reign, for barely a generation. Because Akhenaten's revolution, for all its passion, was almost certainly a failure in its own time, and possibly a disaster. In his fervour for his one god, he seems to have persecuted the old ones, sending his agents up and down the country to hack the name of Amun out of the monuments wherever it appeared, even in the tombs of private people, even inside the very name of his own father. An act of religious vandalism that must have horrified and frightened ordinary Egyptians, for whom the old gods were the guarantors of the harvest and the flood and the safety of the dead. And while the king dreamed of the sun in his gleaming new city, the empire his forefathers had built began quietly to fray. The clay tablet letters found at Amarna include desperate, increasingly frantic appeals from Egypt's loyal vassal kings in Syria and Canaan, begging the pharaoh for troops, for help, for any answer at all, as their cities are attacked and their neighbours turn traitor and the enemies of Egypt press in. And the pharaoh, lost in his devotions, sends little and often nothing, and city after city slips out of Egypt's hands. Whether Akhenaten was a visionary ahead of his time, the first man in history to conceive of a single universal god, or a dangerous fanatic who neglected his kingdom for a private obsession, or, as is the way with real human beings, some impossible mixture of both, has been argued for 100 years, and will be argued for 100 more. And it is one of the things that makes him so endlessly fascinating. But when he died, after 17 years, his god died with him, with astonishing speed. Within a few years his holy city was abandoned, left to the sand, its temples pulled down for their stone, its very existence so thoroughly erased that it was forgotten for 3,000 years. The old gods came flooding back, the priests of Amun returned to their power, and the throne passed, through a shadowy few years and one or two mysterious short-lived rulers, to a small boy, a son of Akhenaten by a lesser wife, a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, who would reign only a short while, who would achieve almost nothing of note, who would die young and be all but forgotten, and who would become, by the strangest chance in all of archaeology, more famous than any other pharaoh who ever lived. The little boy who came to the throne after the death of the Sun King was named, at first, Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, in honour of his father's god. But the men who ruled Egypt in his name, the great officials and generals who guided the child, knew that the revolution was over, that the country longed to return to its old gods and its old ways, and so within a few years the boy's name was changed to the one by which the world now knows him, Tutankhamen, the living image of Amun, and the family that had tried to abolish Amun now bowed before him once more. Under the boy king, or rather under the powerful men behind him, the holy city of Amarna was abandoned. The court returned to the old capitals, the temples of all the gods were reopened and restored and richly re-endowed, and a great inscription was set up in which the young pharaoh, or his ministers speaking through him, lamented the ruin into which the land had fallen when the gods had been neglected, how the temples had lain in weeds and the gods had turned their backs on Egypt, and proclaimed that all of this had now been set right, the offerings renewed, the priesthoods restored, the proper order of the world put back in its place. And having undone his father's revolution and restored the ancient faith, Tutankhamen died, still only a young man of 18 or 19, of what we still cannot say for certain, perhaps of an injury, perhaps of illness, perhaps of some inherited weakness of a family that had married too closely within itself for too long, and he was buried, hurriedly it seems, in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings that was almost certainly not meant for a king at all, too little and too plain for a pharaoh, as though his death had caught everyone unprepared. And there he lay, and here is where the strangest turn in his whole strange story takes place. Because being minor, and being quickly forgotten, and being buried in so small and humble a tomb, turned out, across the long reach of time, to be the greatest good fortune that could possibly have befallen him. For the tombs of all the great pharaohs, the mighty conquerors, and the master builders whose reigns filled the histories, were robbed every one sooner or later in antiquity, their treasures stripped away, their bodies torn apart by robbers hunting for the gold and jewels wrapped within the wrappings, until priests of a later age gathered up the plundered royal mummies and hid them together in secret caches to save what little was left. But Tutankhamen, small and forgotten, was overlooked. His little tomb was entered by robbers once or twice soon after the burial, and partly disturbed, but then resealed, and then, within a couple of centuries, the huts of workmen cutting a grander tomb nearby were built directly over its entrance, burying it under heaps of rubble and chips, and there it vanished, its very location lost, its name half forgotten. And for more than 3,000 years the boy king slept undisturbed beneath the feet of the tourists and the tomb robbers and the archaeologists who came and went in the valley above him, none of them knowing he was there. Until the winter of the year 1922, when a stubborn English archaeologist named Howard Carter, who had been digging in the Valley of the Kings for years without much to show for it, and whose wealthy patron was on the very point of cutting off his funds, cleared away the ancient workmen's huts in one last patch of ground that everyone else had passed over, and found, cut into the rock beneath, a single step, and then another, and then a whole staircase descending to a sealed and plastered doorway, stamped with the marks of the royal burial, and, still intact, the seals of the ancient necropolis guards. He had found an untouched royal tomb, the only one ever found in the valley, more or less whole, the thing every archaeologist dreams of, and none had ever seen. When at last he made a small breach in the sealed doorway of the inner chamber, and held a candle to the hole and put his eye to it, his patron behind him asking whether he could see anything, Carter, struck dumb for a moment by the glint of gold everywhere in the flickering light, could manage only, so the story goes, 3 words: yes, wonderful things. And wonderful they were. The tomb, small and crammed to the ceiling, held the most staggering collection of ancient treasure ever found in one place. thousands upon thousands of objects packed in so tightly it took Carter and his team a full 10 years just to empty and record it all. There were gilded couches carved as sacred beasts, and dismantled chariots sheathed in gold, and thrones and chairs and beds and chests, and jars of perfume and wine and oil, and weapons and walking sticks and games and clothing and sandals, and life-sized black and gold statues of the king standing guard, and shrine within shrine of gilded wood, nested one inside another like a set of golden boxes, and within them at last a great stone sarcophagus, and within that 3 coffins nested one inside the next, the innermost of which was made of over 100 kilograms of solid gold, and within that, wrapped in linen and jewels and amulets, the body of the boy king himself, his face covered by the object that has become the very face of ancient Egypt to the whole of the modern world. The death mask of Tutankhamun, beaten from gold and inlaid with blue glass and lapis and carnelian, the calm young face framed by the striped royal headcloth, the cobra and the vulture on the brow, serene and beautiful and unbearably human, gazing out across 3,300 years with an expression of perfect peace. And here is the thing to hold on to, the thing that makes the mind reel a little in the dark. This was the tomb of a minor king, a boy who died young and achieved almost nothing, buried in haste in a tomb meant for someone lesser, and half-robbed even so. If this was what was left in the small forgotten tomb of a nobody, then what unimaginable oceans of gold must have been buried with a Khufu, with a Thutmose, with a Rameses, in their vast and splendid tombs. Before the robbers came, treasures beyond counting, beyond imagining, all of it gone, melted down and scattered and lost thousands of years ago, so that all our wonder at the riches of the pharaohs rests, in the end, on the leftovers in the tomb of the one king too unimportant to rob properly. The discovery made Tutankhamun, of all people, the most famous pharaoh in history, his golden face reproduced 10 million times, his name known to children who could not name a single other king of Egypt, a boy who was nothing in his own age and is everything in ours. And there is in that reversal a lesson about fame and time and chance that the Egyptians themselves, so concerned with being remembered, might have found either comforting or unbearable, and perhaps a little of each. But the boy king had no son to follow him, and with his early death the great royal line of the early New Kingdom, the line of the conquerors and the sun-worshipper, guttered out. An old official took the throne, and then a tough old general, and out of that soldier's family would come the pharaohs of the next great dynasty, the ones who would carry Egypt to its very last blaze of imperial glory, and give it the most famous name of all its warrior kings. The soldier's family that took the throne after the last of the Sun King's line are the pharaohs we call the 19th dynasty, and their business, first and last, was the restoration of Egypt's strength and glory after the confusion and neglect of the Amarna years. The old general who founded the line reigned only briefly, but his son, Seti I, was a king of the old heroic mould, who marched his armies back into Syria and Canaan to recover the empire that Akhenaten had let slip, winning back city after city, and who lavished the wealth of these campaigns on the gods, above all on the great temple of Amun at Karnak, where it was Seti who raised the towering columns of the famous hypostyle hall, that stone forest we walked through earlier, and who built, at the sacred city of Abydos, one of the most beautiful temples in all of Egypt, its walls covered with reliefs carved so delicately and so perfectly, the figures so serene and so refined, that they are counted among the finest work Egyptian sculptors ever produced. But magnificent as Seti was, he is remembered today chiefly as the father of the man who would become the very image of the Egyptian pharaoh for all time, the king the Greeks would call the Great, the king whose name would be given, in the end, to a whole age, Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. He came to the throne as a young man, and he held it for an extraordinary length of time, 66 years, so long that most of his subjects lived their whole lives and died having known no other king, so long that he outlived a dozen of his own heirs and was finally succeeded by a son already old, so long that he became in the minds of his people less a man than a fixed feature of the world, like the river or the sun. He fathered, by a small army of wives, something well over 100 children, and he built more and bigger than any pharaoh before or since, covering Egypt from the delta to deep in Nubia with his temples and his statues and his inscriptions, so that wherever you go in Egypt today, the odds are good that the giant stone king looming over you is Ramesses, because he not only raised countless monuments of his own, but had a cheerful habit of carving his name over the work of earlier kings, claiming their monuments for himself, which is a form of immortality, if not the most honest one. And early in that immense reign, as a young and ambitious king, eager to prove himself the equal of his warrior forefathers, Ramesses marched north into Syria to confront the one great rival that still stood against Egypt in the world, the mighty empire of the Hittites, who had come down out of the mountains of Anatolia to contest the lands of Syria. And the two greatest powers of the age met in battle near a city called Kadesh on the river Orontes, in what may have been the largest chariot battle ever fought. Thousands of chariots wheeling and charging across the plain. And the battle very nearly ended in disaster for Ramesses, because he had been fed false information by enemy spies pretending to be deserters, who told him the Hittite army was still far away, and so he advanced carelessly with only part of his forces, and the Hittites, who were in fact hidden just beyond the city, fell upon his strung-out army and cut it in two, and were within a hair of destroying the king and his household entirely. What actually saved the day was a mixture of Ramesses' own personal courage, rallying his broken guard around him and fighting to hold on, and the lucky arrival of a fresh Egyptian detachment at exactly the right moment. And the battle ended not in the crushing victory Egyptian propaganda would claim, but in something much closer to a bloody draw, after which both armies withdrew and Ramesses went home having failed to take Kadesh at all. And yet, and this is the truly Egyptian part of the story, Ramesses returned to Egypt and had the battle carved and painted on the walls of temple after temple, at Karnak, at Luxor, at Abydos, at his own great funerary temple, as the most glorious victory in the history of the world, himself shown as a giant towering over the tiny fleeing Hittites, single-handedly turning the tide, the mighty Pharaoh scattering his enemies like chaff, and he repeated this so often and so grandly that for 3,000 years, until scholars learned to read the Hittite records too, the world believed him. It is one of the earliest and most brazen examples in history of a leader turning a narrow escape into a triumph by the sheer force of controlling the story, and there is something almost admirable in the nerve of it. In the end, neither empire could destroy the other, and after years of exhausting, inconclusive war along the Syrian frontier, Ramesses and the Hittite king did something genuinely remarkable, something wiser than all the fighting. They made peace. A formal treaty of peace and alliance and mutual defence, sworn between the two great powers, promising to end the war, to return each other's fugitives, to come to one another's aid against attack, a treaty of which we have both the Egyptian version, carved on the temple walls, and the Hittite version, found on clay tablets in their ruined capital far to the north, the two copies agreeing closely. The oldest surviving international peace treaty in the history of the world, so justly famous that a copy of it hangs today on the wall of the United Nations building in New York, 3,000 years after two ancient kings, tired of burying their sons, decided that peace was better than glory. And the peace was sealed, in the old way, by marriage, the Hittite king sending his daughter to become one of Ramesses' queens, and the reliefs show the foreign princess arriving in Egypt in state, and even, in the poem carved to celebrate it, the weather itself turning mild and kind for her journey, because the gods were pleased. His greatest monument, and to my eye one of the most astonishing things human beings have ever made, stands far up the Nile in Nubia, at a place called Abu Simbel, where Ramesses ordered his workmen to carve an entire temple not on the rock but into it, cutting straight back into the face of a sandstone cliff. And before its entrance they carved 4 colossal seated statues of the king himself, each one 65 feet high, 4 titanic Ramesses gazing out across the river toward the rising sun, so vast that the human beings at their feet are like ants, meant to overawe the Nubians sailing north and to proclaim, in the most direct possible language of scale, that here ruled a god. And the temple was cut so cleverly into the mountain that on 2 days of the year, and only 2, the rays of the rising sun reach all the way down the long dark passage into the innermost sanctuary, 60 meters inside the rock, and light up the statues of the gods seated there in the blackness. A piece of astronomical precision built into a mountain of stone 3,200 years ago. And in the 20th century, when the building of a great new dam threatened to drown Abu Simbel forever beneath the rising waters of a new lake, the nations of the world came together and did an almost equally astonishing thing. They cut the entire temple, colossi and all, into more than 1,000 great blocks, and lifted it, piece by piece, and rebuilt it exactly as it had been, on higher ground above the flood, so that the 4 giant kings still gaze out across the water toward the sunrise, moved but not lost, saved by the same human ingenuity that first raised them. Ramesses ruled his 66 years and died at last a very old man, well into his 80s or beyond, worn down by the arthritis and the abscessed teeth and the hardened arteries that we can read today in his actual preserved body, one of the royal mummies rescued long ago by the priests and now resting in a museum in Cairo. The actual face of the actual man who fought at Kadesh and made the peace and built the mountain temple, his hooked nose and his few strands of hair dyed with henna still there to be seen. Which is a strange and moving thing, to be able to look upon the very face of a king who died 3,000 years ago. But he was, in a sense, too successful, too long-lived, too grand, and after him the long slow evening of Egypt's greatness truly began, because no one who came after could ever be Ramesses the Great, though a startling number of them took his name and tried. The world into which Ramesses the Great had been born was a world of great and settled powers. Egypt and the Hittites and Babylon and Assyria and the trading cities of the coast, all bound together by commerce and diplomacy and the exchange of gifts and brides. A comfortable and connected Bronze Age world that had lasted for centuries and must have seemed as though it would last forever. But within a generation or two of his death, that whole world came crashing down in one of the greatest and most mysterious catastrophes in all of history, an age of collapse in which across a single lifetime kingdom after kingdom fell, city after city burned, and the bright connected Bronze Age world went dark. We still do not fully understand what happened, whether it was earthquake or drought or famine or plague or war, or the failure of the trade routes, or most likely all of these things together in a great cascade of disaster feeding upon disaster, but we know some of what it looked like, because the Egyptian records describe, with real fear, the coming of a great confederation of displaced and desperate peoples they called simply the Sea Peoples, waves of migrants and raiders and whole nations on the move, men and women and children in ox carts with all their possessions, sweeping down by land and by sea out of the north and the west, uprooted from their own ruined homelands and looking for new ones, and burning and fighting their way through everything in their path. The mighty Hittite Empire, Egypt's old rival, was simply swept away, wiped from the map, its great capital burned and abandoned, never to rise again. The rich cities of the Syrian and Canaanite coast fell one after another, and this vast tide of desperate humanity rolled at last against the borders of Egypt itself, and it fell to a pharaoh named Ramesses III, the last great warrior King Egypt would ever produce, to meet it. In 2 tremendous battles, one on land at the edge of the delta and one at sea in the mouths of the Nile, Ramesses III fought the Sea Peoples and, at enormous cost, held them off, saved Egypt from the fate that had swallowed the Hittites, and drove the invaders back. Some of them to settle along the coast of Canaan, where one of these Sea Peoples, called by the Egyptians the Peliset, would give their name to the land we still call, after them, Palestine. The great sea battle is carved on the walls of Ramesses III's magnificent funerary temple. The tangled ships and the drowning men, one of the first depictions of a naval battle in history. But holding off the Sea Peoples was the last great feat of Egyptian arms, and even the rain that achieved it showed how far the old strength had ebbed, because it was in the reign of this same Ramesses III that we hear, for the first time in Egyptian history, of something that would have been unthinkable in the confident old days, a strike by the workers of the state. The skilled craftsmen who cut and decorated the royal tombs, who lived together in their own village near the Valley of the Kings, found that their rations, the grain and provisions that were their pay, were arriving late and short, because the machinery of the state was faltering, and so they downed their tools and marched in protest and sat down at the temples and refused to work until they were paid, the oldest recorded labour strike in the history of the world, and there is something oddly heartening in it, that among the very first things ordinary working people are recorded as doing, once they are recorded at all, is to stand together and demand to be paid what they are owed. Ramesses III himself came to a dark end, the target of a genuine conspiracy hatched within his own harem, in which one of his lesser wives plotted to murder him and put her own son on the throne in place of the rightful heir. And we have the actual records of the trial that followed, the charges and the accused and the judges, some of whom were themselves caught taking bribes from the plotters and punished in their turn, and it seems from the evidence of his mummy, whose throat was found deeply cut beneath its wrappings only in recent years, that the conspirators did in fact succeed in killing the old king, though they failed to seize the throne. After him came a whole dreary succession of kings all named Ramesses, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and onward, none of them remembered for anything much, under whom Egypt grew steadily poorer and weaker and more troubled. The empire in Asia was gone. The gold of Nubia dwindled. The harvests faltered and the price of grain soared, and the very tombs of the great pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings began to be robbed systematically, sometimes with the connivance of the officials who were supposed to guard them, and we have once again the astonishing records of the investigations and the trials. The confessions of the tomb robbers extracted under beating, describing how they tunnelled into the tombs of kings and tore the gold from the very bodies of the pharaohs and divided the spoil. The actual voices of the men who plundered the resting places of Ramesses' own ancestors, while his feeble descendants looked on helpless or complicit. And as the central power decayed, Egypt did what it had done before at the end of each of its great ages. It split. The high priests of Ammon at Thebes, grown enormously rich and powerful on centuries of royal gifts, controlling vast lands and their own armies, simply took over the whole of the south and ruled it as a kind of priestly state in the name of their god, while a line of kings ruled the north from a delta city called Tanis, and the two lands, so hard won and so often reunited, fell apart once more into the long fragmented centuries we call the Third Intermediate Period. It was not, for the most part, a violent or a terrible time, not like the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Life along the river went on much as it always had, the farmers farming and the priests praying and the flood rising and falling. But Egypt was no longer one, and no longer strong, and no longer the master of its own fate, and into the space left by its weakness came new peoples to rule it. First came kings of Libyan descent, the sons of those desert peoples from the west whom the pharaohs had once fought, and then settled as soldiers within Egypt, who now, generations later, wore the double crown themselves, ruling as thoroughly Egyptian pharaohs though their forefathers had been foreigners. And then, from the south, from deep in Nubia, from the very lands Egypt had once ruled and colonized, came a line of black African kings out of the kingdom of Cush, who had absorbed Egyptian religion and Egyptian culture and Egyptian gods so completely that they saw themselves as the truest and most pious Egyptians of all, more devoted to Amun than the Egyptians themselves, and who marched north to reunite the whole valley under their rule and to restore, as they saw it, the ancient faith and the ancient standards that the Egyptians had let decay. For a brief and brilliant moment these Nubian pharaohs, the kings of the 25th dynasty, ruled an Egypt that stretched once again from the far south to the sea, and they built and restored and revived the old ways with tremendous energy and evident sincerity, and they even took up again, far to the south in their own homeland, the ancient custom of building pyramids for their kings, steep little pyramids that still stand in the deserts of Sudan to this day. More pyramids, in fact, than there are in Egypt itself, a strange and beautiful afterlife of the old idea, flowering again 1,000 miles up the river and 2,000 years after Giza. But the age of the small and separate kingdoms was over, and a new kind of power had risen in the world, greater and more terrible than anything Egypt had faced before, and it was coming. The new power was Assyria, a fierce and disciplined and terrifyingly efficient empire risen in the north of Mesopotamia, in the land between the two rivers where, if you remember, our whole story of cities and kings first began thousands of years before. The Assyrians had built the largest and most professional army the world had yet seen, an army of iron discipline and siege engines and mass deportations and calculated terror, and they had swallowed nearly the whole of the Near East, and when the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt meddled in the affairs of the small kingdoms of Palestine, encouraging them to resist Assyrian power, the Assyrians turned their terrible attention south toward the Nile, and they did what no invader had ever managed in the whole long history of Egypt. They broke through the desert walls and conquered the land itself, marching all the way up the valley, sacking the great and ancient city of Thebes, the city of Amun, jewel of the new kingdom, carrying off its treasures and its people, a catastrophe so shocking that its echo can be heard even in the Hebrew. Scriptures, where a prophet points to the fall of mighty Thebes as a warning of what awaits the proud. The Nubian pharaohs were driven back south to their homeland, and Egypt lay, for a time, a conquered province of a foreign empire ruled from far away. But Assyria had overreached, its empire stretched too thin, too hated, held together by too much fear, and when it began to totter, a clever and capable line of Egyptian princes from the delta city of Sais, whom the Assyrians had left as their governors, quietly slipped the leash, threw off the foreign yoke, reunited Egypt once more under native rule, and gave the old country one last, long golden evening of independence and prosperity. The age we call the Saite period, the 26th dynasty. It was a time of deliberate, conscious, almost wistful looking backward. For these last native pharaohs, ruling an old and battered and much humbled Egypt, gazed back across the 2,000 years to the glory of the old and middle kingdoms, and set themselves to recapture it, copying the art and the styles and the titles and even the language of those distant golden ages so carefully and so skillfully that scholars are sometimes hard-pressed to tell a site statue from one made 1,500 years earlier, a whole civilization in loving, melancholy conversation with its own deep past. They reopened the trade routes and welcomed foreign merchants, above all the Greeks, who were just then spreading out across the whole Mediterranean, and who were permitted to found a trading city of their own in the Delta, so that for the first time large numbers of Greeks came to live in Egypt and to gaze in wonder at its monuments, already unimaginably ancient even then, and to carry home to the young and curious Greek world the tales of this deep and venerable and mysterious civilization, until Egypt became, in the Greek imagination, the very fountainhead of wisdom and antiquity, the place where everything was oldest and strangest and most profound. The great Greek historian Herodotus came to Egypt in this age, or a little after, and wandered its temples, and interviewed its priests, and wrote down everything he was told, the true and the false, and the wonderful alike, and gave to the Western world its first great description of Egypt, its customs and its monuments and its animals and its river, much of it wildly garbled and some of it exactly right. And it was he who wrote the phrase that has clung to Egypt ever since, that it is the gift of the river, the gift of the Nile. But this lovely long evening could not last, because a new empire, greater than Assyria, greater than any that had yet existed, was rising in the east, the empire of the Persians, which under its kings swallowed Babylon and Assyria's remnants and the whole of the Near East from India to the edge of Greece, and it was only a matter of time before it too reached for Egypt. The Persian king Cambyses marched his army across the Sinai desert, defeated the last Saite pharaoh, and made Egypt a province of the Persian Empire, around 525 years before the birth of Christ, and this time the foreign rule would not be so easily shaken. For nearly 2 centuries, with only a few brief and hard-won intervals of renewed independence, when the Egyptians rose and threw the Persians out for a generation or two before being reconquered, Egypt was a Persian province, a distant satrapy ruled by a foreign governor in the name of a foreign king of kings far away in his palace in the mountains of Iran, its wealth taxed away, its people restless, its ancient pride wounded. The Greek stories, which hated the Persians, painted their rule in the blackest colours, telling how Cambyses had mocked the Egyptian gods and stabbed the sacred bull with his own hand and gone mad, and though much of this is surely Greek propaganda, and some Persian kings ruled Egypt with respect and care, restoring its temples and honouring its gods, there is no doubt that the Egyptians chafed bitterly under foreign masters and rose against them again and again. And so, by the middle of the 4th century before the birth of Christ, Egypt was a weary and ancient land, 3,000 years deep in its own history, that had seen its own native kings dwindle and its throne pass to Libyans and Nubians and Assyrians and Persians, a garden whose walls had at last been breached for good, waiting, though it did not know it, for the arrival of one more conqueror. A young man from a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, a conqueror unlike any who had come before, who would take Egypt not as a prize to be plundered, but as a home to be loved, and who would, in the doing of it, open the very last and in some ways the most brilliant chapter of the whole long story. His name was Alexander, and the world would call him great. Alexander of Macedon came down into Egypt in the autumn of the year 332 years before the birth of Christ, at the head of the army with which he was in the very act of conquering the whole Persian Empire, and the Egyptians, who hated their Persian masters, did not resist him, but welcomed him almost as a liberator, opening their cities to him, so that he took the ancient land without a battle. And Alexander, unlike so many conquerors before him, understood at once that Egypt was not a place to be looted and left, but an ancient and sacred and immensely rich land that must be honoured if it was to be held. So he went to Memphis, the old white-walled capital, and there he did the thing that won the hearts of the Egyptian priests. He made offering to their gods, above all to the sacred bull of Memphis, and he took the throne with the full and proper rights of an Egyptian pharaoh, presenting himself not as a foreign occupier, but as the legitimate king of Egypt, the restorer of the land, the rightful successor to its ancient line, so that in the temple reliefs he appears in the kilt and the crowns of a true pharaoh. Making offerings to the gods like any king of the great dynasties before him, a Macedonian Greek become, by right and by respect, a son of the Nile. And then he did 2 things that would echo for a very long time. First, he travelled out across the western desert, on a long and dangerous journey through the sands, to a remote oasis called Siwa, where there stood a famous and ancient oracle of the god the Egyptians called Amun, and the Greeks called Ammon, and there alone he consulted the god, and whatever the oracle told him in the secret of the shrine, he never fully revealed. But he came out changed, and thereafter let it be understood that he was no mere mortal king, but the son of a god. A belief that would harden, in the years to come, into something that reshaped how kings and rulers across the whole Western world would think of themselves for centuries. And second, and far more lastingly, before he marched away east to finish his conquest of Persia and to his own early death, he chose on the Mediterranean coast, at the western edge of the delta, on a narrow spit of land between the sea and a lake, the site for a new city, a Greek city, which he laid out himself, tracing its walls and its great avenues, and which he named, as conquerors will, after himself, Alexandria. He would never see it built. He marched away into Asia and never returned to Egypt alive, and within a few years, at the age of only 32, having conquered the greatest empire the world had ever seen from Greece to the edge of India, Alexander died suddenly of a fever in Babylon, leaving no competent heir and an empire far too vast to hold together, and his generals fell at once to fighting over the pieces. But the city he had founded would become, within a lifetime, the greatest and most brilliant city in the entire world, and would remain so for centuries. And here is a strange and fitting thing: a small circle closing. When Alexander died, his generals carved up his empire among themselves, and the general who seized Egypt, one of Alexander's closest companions and boyhood friends, a shrewd and capable and long-headed man named Ptolemy, understood the immense value, both practical and symbolic, of Alexander's own body. And so, as the great funeral cortege bearing the embalmed conqueror made its slow way from Babylon back toward Macedonia, Ptolemy intercepted it, hijacked it, one might almost say, and carried the body of Alexander off to Egypt instead, and entombed it in splendour in the new city of Alexandria, so that the founder himself lay forever at the heart of the city that bore his name, a sacred relic and a source of legitimacy that drew pilgrims and emperors for centuries. Until, sometime in the long fog of later history, the tomb of Alexander was lost, and it remains lost to this day, one of the great missing treasures of the world, somewhere perhaps still beneath the streets of the modern city. And this Ptolemy, having made himself master of Egypt, in time stopped pretending to rule on behalf of Alexander's phantom heirs, and simply took the crown himself, and had himself made Pharaoh, founding the last dynasty ever to rule ancient Egypt, a line of Greek-speaking Macedonian kings, every one of the men named Ptolemy, who would rule Egypt for very nearly 300 years, from the death of Alexander down to the coming of Rome. It was in many ways a strange and double-natured kingdom that the Ptolemies built. On the one hand, to the Egyptians, in the old temples up and down the Nile, they presented themselves exactly as Alexander had, as true and traditional pharaohs, and they built for the Egyptian gods on a scale not seen in 1,000 years, raising great temples that are among the best preserved in all of Egypt today, precisely because they are the latest, the wonderfully complete temple of the falcon god Horus at Edfu, the beautiful temple of the goddess Hathor at Dendera, the island temple of Isis at Philae, all of them built by these Greek kings in the full and correct ancient Egyptian style, covered in hieroglyphs and traditional reliefs of the king offering to the gods, so that a visitor to Edfu today, walking through its towering and almost intact halls, is walking through a temple built by Greeks in the manner of a civilization already 3,000 years old, the very last flowering of the ancient tradition. But on the other hand, the Ptolemies themselves remained thoroughly Greek, ruling from their glittering Greek capital on the coast, speaking Greek, thinking Greek, marrying, in the manner of the old pharaohs but scandalously to Greek eyes, their own sisters, and holding the native Egyptians very much as a subject people beneath the ruling Greek elite. A division that would breed resentment and revolt across the whole 3 centuries of their rule, and their capital, Alexandria, became the wonder of the age. Facing the sea, it was crowned by one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Pharaohs, a lighthouse of white stone rising perhaps 400 feet, a fire burning at its summit, and a great mirror to throw the light far out to sea to guide the ships into the greatest harbour in the world, so famous that its very name, Pharaohs, became the word for lighthouse in a dozen languages. And at the heart of the city the Ptolemies built the thing for which Alexandria was most justly and most tenderly remembered, the museum and the great library, an institution founded to gather, quite literally, all the knowledge in the world. The Library of Alexandria was one of the noblest ideas any human beings have ever had. The idea that all the knowledge and all the wisdom and all the poetry and all the science of the entire world might be gathered together in one place, copied and preserved and studied and added to, so that no truth once found need ever be lost again. The Ptolemies pursued this dream with a wonderful and slightly ruthless energy. They sent agents out across the whole Mediterranean and the Near East to buy up books, scrolls of papyrus, in every language they could find, and it is said that every ship that put into the great harbour of Alexandria was searched, not for contraband, but for books, and any scroll found aboard was taken and copied. The copy given back to the owner and the original kept for the library, which is a form of theft, if a rather flattering one. They borrowed the official master copies of the great Athenian plays, put down an enormous deposit to guarantee their return, then kept the originals, forfeited the deposit, and sent Athens the copies, deciding, correctly, that the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides were worth more than any sum of gold. And they gathered at the height of it some hundreds of thousands of scrolls, very nearly the whole written inheritance of the ancient world, under one roof. And around the library they built the museum, which did not mean then what it means now, a place of dusty display, but rather a house of the muses, a great residential institution where the finest scholars and scientists and poets and mathematicians of the age were brought to live at the king's expense, fed and housed and freed from all other cares, so that they could do nothing but think and study and teach and argue. The first great publicly funded research institution in the history of the world, a university and an academy of sciences 2,000 years before either had a name, and the work they did there still shapes the world you live in. It was at Alexandria that a mathematician named Euclid wrote the textbook of geometry that would be used, more or less unchanged, for the next 2,000 years, so that when you learned in school that the angles of a triangle add up to a straight line, you were learning from a book written in Ptolemaic Egypt. It was there that a scholar named Eratosthenes, knowing that at noon on a certain day the sun shone straight down a well in one city and cast a measurable shadow in another, and knowing the distance between them, calculated with nothing but shadows and geometry, and a marvellously clear mind the circumference of the whole round earth, and got it very nearly right, more than 1,700 years before Columbus. It was there that astronomers mapped the stars and argued, some of them, that the earth might go around the sun. It was there that the great poems and plays of Greece were collected and edited and preserved, so that a very great deal of what survives to us today of the literature of the ancient world survives, because it passed, at some point, through the Library of Alexandria. And it was there, in this Greek and Egyptian and cosmopolitan city, that Jewish scholars first translated their scriptures into Greek, the version through which those ancient writings would reach the wider world. The eventual loss of the library, its slow decline and its final destruction across the troubled later centuries, in fires and civil wars and the general decay of the ancient world, is one of the great tragedies of history, a wound in the memory of the human race. And though we do not know exactly how or when the last scrolls perished, we know what was lost: an ocean of knowledge, whole libraries of plays and poems and histories and sciences that no one will ever read again, gone as utterly as the Green Sahara. And the thought of it can still make a book lover ache, but all of that lay in the future. In its early centuries Alexandria blazed, the brightest lamp of learning in the world, and the Ptolemies who paid for it, whatever their faults, deserve to be remembered for that light. Their faults, however, were considerable, and they grew worse with every generation, because the later Ptolemies, cut off in their glittering palace from the people they ruled, marrying their own siblings until the family tree became a family thicket, fell into a long and gruesome spiral of murder and intrigue and civil war that reads less like the history of a kingdom than like the plot of a particularly bloodthirsty tragedy. Brother married sister and then murdered her, or she him. Mothers plotted against sons and sons against mothers. Uncles murdered nephews. One Ptolemy, hated by the people of Alexandria, murdered his own son, cut the body into pieces, and sent it to the boy's mother as a birthday present. An act so monstrous that it has never quite been forgotten. Kings were driven out by their own people and clawed their way back with foreign armies. And through all of this, the real power in the wider world was shifting decisively westward toward a new and rising and utterly formidable state that had grown up on the far side of the Mediterranean and was swallowing the old Greek kingdoms one by one, a republic soon to be an empire. Hard and disciplined and endlessly ambitious, the power of Rome. The later Ptolemies survived, increasingly, not by their own strength, which had all but vanished, but by the sufferance of Rome, playing the game of a client kingdom, bribing Roman senators, appealing to Roman generals, propping up their tottering thrones with Roman support and Roman loans, until Egypt, the oldest and once the proudest kingdom in the world, had become in all but name a dependency of Rome, its kings ruling only so long as Rome allowed, its immense wealth, its endless grain, the great prize that ambitious Romans eyed with open hunger. It was into this world, a world of a decaying dynasty and a rising Rome, of a glittering doomed city, and a kingdom living on borrowed time, that there was born, around the year 69 before the birth of Christ, the last and by far the most famous of all the Ptolemies, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, a woman whose name has echoed down more than 2,000 years and lost none of its power, a woman we call Cleopatra. Cleopatra has come down to us wrapped in so many layers of legend and romance and slander that it takes a real effort to see the woman underneath, and the effort is worth making, because the real Cleopatra was far more impressive than the seductress of the stories. She was, first of all, formidably intelligent and superbly educated, a true child of Alexandria in its learning, who is said to have spoken as many as 9 languages, and who was, remarkably, the first ruler of her entire Greek dynasty, after nearly 300 years, to bother to learn the language of the Egyptian people she ruled, so that she could speak to the priests and the peasants of the Nile in their own ancient tongue, without an interpreter, which tells you something important about her. That she understood, as her ancestors had not, that Egypt was not merely a Greek possession but a living and ancient nation whose loyalty had to be won. The Roman and Greek writers who are our main sources hated and feared her, and it is telling that even they, straining to diminish her, admit that her true weapon was not her beauty, which they describe as merely pleasant rather than remarkable, but the extraordinary charm and wit and force of her presence, the spell of her conversation, the intelligence and the will that made her, for a few short years, one of the most powerful people in the entire world. She came to the throne as a young woman of 18, jointly, in the family fashion, with her still younger brother, whom she was also, in the family fashion, expected to marry, and almost at once the two of them fell to fighting over which would truly rule, and Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria by her brother's faction and forced into exile, raising an army in the desert to fight her way back. And it was at exactly this moment, with Cleopatra in exile and her brother holding the capital, that the most powerful man in the world arrived in Alexandria, in pursuit of his defeated rival across the wreckage of a Roman civil war, the general and dictator Julius Caesar. Caesar took up residence in the royal palace and set himself to settle the Egyptian dispute, chiefly because he wanted Egypt's grain and Egypt's money for his own struggles, and Cleopatra understood at once that her whole future, her throne, and perhaps her life, depended on reaching this Roman before her brother's people could, and reaching him not as a suppliant, but on her own terms, and so she had herself smuggled into the palace, past her brother's guards, and the story, which may even be true, is that she was carried in wrapped inside a rolled-up carpet or a bundle of bedding, brought as a gift to Caesar and unrolled before him, so that the great Roman found himself suddenly face to face with the young queen of Egypt, who had just had herself delivered to him like a parcel, an entrance of such audacity and wit that it seems to have delighted and captivated him at once. Cleopatra was perhaps 21, Caesar in his 50s, and whatever passed between them of calculation and whatever of genuine feeling, the two of them became allies and lovers both, and Caesar threw the whole weight of Rome behind her. In the fighting that followed, the Alexandrian War, Caesar and Cleopatra were besieged in the palace quarter by her brother's forces, and it was during this fighting, tradition holds, that fire spread from the burning ships in the harbour into the city and did great damage, and some believe that a part of the great library's collection was lost in these flames. An incidental casualty of a squalid dynastic quarrel, though the library certainly survived in some form long after. When Roman reinforcements arrived, Caesar crushed the opposing army, Cleopatra's brother drowned in the Nile fleeing the battle, and Cleopatra was left at 21, the sole and undisputed ruler of Egypt, secured on her throne by the master of the Roman world, who was also the father of the son she now bore him, a boy she named Ptolemy Caesar, whom the people of Alexandria nicknamed Caesarion, Little Caesar. For a golden moment it must have seemed to Cleopatra that she held the future in her hands, that through Caesar and their son she might bind Egypt and Rome together, might make her ancient kingdom not Rome's victim, but Rome's partner, might see her own blood rule the whole of the known world. She travelled to Rome itself and stayed there, in Caesar's own villa, a foreign queen at the heart of the Republic, scandalizing the stiff old Romans who whispered that Caesar meant to make himself a king, an Eastern-style god-king, with this Egyptian sorceress at his side. And then, on a spring day in the year 44 before the birth of Christ, in the very hour of his greatest power, Julius Caesar was struck down and stabbed to death by a conspiracy of his fellow senators on the floor of the Roman Senate, and all of Cleopatra's careful, brilliant, ambitious calculations collapsed in a single morning of Roman blood. She was in Rome when it happened, a foreign queen suddenly without her protector, in a city descending into chaos, her whole position turned in an instant from triumph to deadly danger, and she gathered her son and fled back to the one place in the world that was still hers, back to Egypt, back to Alexandria, back to the throne of the Pharaohs. To wait and to watch and to see which way the Roman world would break, and to plan, with the patience and the nerve that were her true genius, how a clever queen of a rich but weak old kingdom might yet survive, and even prosper, in the terrible new world that Caesar's murder had unleashed. For Rome now fell into a fresh and even more terrible civil war, the assassins against the heirs of Caesar, and out of that war two men would emerge to divide the Roman world between them, and to decide between them the fate of Egypt and of Cleopatra both. One was Caesar's cool, calculating, sickly, and utterly ruthless young grandnephew, and adopted heir, a youth of no great presence, but of a political genius that would in time make him the first emperor of Rome. And the other was Caesar's great lieutenant, the bluff, brave, generous, hard-drinking, larger-than-life soldier who had been the dead dictator's right hand, and who now took for himself the rule of the wealthy Greek East, which meant that he took, whether he willed it or not, an appointment with the Queen of Egypt. His name was Mark Antony, and his meeting with Cleopatra would become the most famous love story of the ancient world, and the death of them both would be the death of ancient Egypt itself. When Mark Antony took up the rule of the Roman East, he summoned Cleopatra to meet him, to answer for her conduct during the recent wars and, more to the point, to secure the wealth of Egypt for his coming campaigns. And Cleopatra, who had learned from her first meeting with a great Roman exactly how much a grand entrance was worth, did not come humbly. She sailed to meet him up a river in the east on a barge that has become, through the words of later poets, one of the most famous images in all of literature. A barge with a gilded stern and purple sails and silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes and harps. The queen herself reclining beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as the goddess of love, fanned by boys costumed as cupids, while the sweet smell of burning incense drifted from the ship across the water to the crowds gathered on the banks. So that word ran through the whole city that the goddess had come to feast with the god. Antony, who had meant to summon and to judge her, found himself instead her guest, and then her lover, and then, in a way, her captive, for the alliance that began as calculation on both sides deepened, at least on his, into something that consumed him. And he followed her back to Alexandria, and spent the winter there in a whirl of feasting and pleasure and extravagance so famous that they founded, half-jokingly, a society they called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to enjoying life on a scale no one could match. But it was not all feasting. Antony needed Egypt's wealth, and Cleopatra needed Antony's power, and together they made a genuine alliance of state, Antony recognizing Cleopatra's rule and restoring to Egypt many of the eastern territories her ancestors had lost. Cleopatra bearing Antony children, twins first, a boy and a girl whom they named for the sun and the moon, and pouring the resources of Egypt into Antony's great project, the conquest of the Parthian Empire in the east, the one campaign that might have made him the equal of Caesar. That campaign failed, disastrously, Antony's army shattered by the Parthians and the eastern winter, and from that failure his fortunes never fully recovered, and he leaned ever more heavily on Cleopatra and on Egypt, until, in the eyes of Rome, he had ceased to be a Roman leader at all and become something worse, the consort of a foreign queen, an Eastern despot in the making, a Roman who had gone native, who lounged in an Egyptian palace and gave Roman lands to a foreign woman and her half-Egyptian children. And this was exactly the picture that his rival back in Rome, Caesar's cold young heir, set out to paint with masterful skill. For the young man understood that he could not easily rouse Rome to another civil war against a fellow Roman like Antony, but that he could rouse all of Rome's deep fear and contempt of the foreign, of the Eastern, of the female, against the figure of Cleopatra, the scheming Egyptian sorceress who had bewitched a good Roman soldier and meant, so the propaganda screamed, to make herself queen of Rome itself and to hand the empire over to the East. He seized, by rather dubious means, a document he claimed was Antony's will, and read out to the Roman people its most inflammatory provisions, that Antony wished to be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra. Proof, the young Caesar cried, that the man had abandoned Rome altogether. And so war was declared, not on Antony, carefully, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen. And the whole thing was cast not as another dreary Roman civil war, but as a righteous struggle of West against East, of Rome against Egypt, of Roman virtue against Egyptian decadence. And the two sides gathered their fleets and their armies for the reckoning. The two forces met at last in the year 31 before the birth of Christ, off the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, in a great sea battle that would decide the fate of the Roman world and of Egypt together. And at Actium everything went wrong for Antony and Cleopatra. Their forces were larger but sickly and demoralized, blockaded and short of supplies, riddled with desertion, and in the confused and terrible battle, as the day turned against them, Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron held in reserve suddenly hoisted sail and broke away, fleeing south through a gap in the fighting toward the open sea and home, and Antony, seeing her go, abandoned his own fleet and his own men in the very midst of the battle, and raced after her in a smaller ship, leaving his leaderless forces to fight on a while and then surrender. Whether this was a prearranged plan to save what they could, or a panic, or a betrayal, has been argued ever since, but the effect was the same. The cause of Antony and Cleopatra was lost at Actium, their power broken, their prestige destroyed, and there was nothing left for them but to flee back to Egypt and wait for the end. And the end came the following year, when the victorious young Caesar brought his army down into Egypt at last, marching on Alexandria to finish it. Antony's remaining forces melted away or went over to the enemy, his last soldiers deserting him on the final morning, and Antony, his cause hopeless, his honour gone, and having received, whether by error or by design, a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, fell upon his own sword in the old Roman way, and died, the stories say, in Cleopatra's arms after all, hauled up to the upper chamber where she had barricaded herself, the great soldier bleeding out his life at the feet of the queen for whom he had thrown away. The Roman world. And then it was Cleopatra's turn, and she faced it with a nerve and a dignity that even her Roman enemies could not deny her. She was taken prisoner by the young Caesar, who wanted her alive above all else, wanted to carry her back to Rome in chains to walk behind his chariot in his triumph. The captured queen of Egypt paraded through the streets as the trophy of his victory, the ultimate proof of Rome's mastery of the East. And this, of all fates, Cleopatra would not accept. The last queen of Egypt, the last pharaoh of a line of god kings 3,000 years long, would not be led through Rome as a spectacle. And so, while she was still held under guard, but with her servants about her, she found a way. The tradition says by having a venomous snake, an asp, smuggled to her hidden in a basket of figs, and she dressed herself in her full royal robes and her crown, and lay down upon a golden couch, and let the serpent do its work, and died as a queen and a goddess, on her own terms, cheating her conqueror of his prize, so that when his men burst in they found her already dead, laid out in royal splendour. with her 2 faithful waiting women dying beside her, one of them with her last strength still straightening the crown upon her mistress's brow. She was 39 years old. And with her death, the throne of Egypt, which had passed down for 3,000 years from Narmer to the Ptolemies, came to its end forever. The young Caesar, who after his victory would take the name Augustus and become the first emperor of Rome, did one more cold and necessary thing before he left Egypt. He found and killed Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, the boy Caesarion, now a youth of 17, the one person alive who could claim to be at once the son of Caesar and the heir of the Pharaohs, too dangerous a bloodline to be left breathing. And, with the death of that boy, the line of Egyptian kingship was truly and finally extinguished, and the last of Alexander's successors was gone. Egypt did not become an ordinary province of Rome like Gaul or Spain. It became something stranger and more particular, the personal possession of the emperor himself, ruled not by a senator, but by a governor appointed directly by the emperor and answerable to him alone, and no Roman senator was even permitted to set foot in Egypt without the emperor's express leave. Because Egypt was too rich, too strategic, too dangerous a prize to be trusted to anyone who might use it as a base to seize the empire. For Egypt was now the granary of Rome, the breadbasket of the whole Mediterranean world, its endless fields of grain, watered by the ever-faithful flood, shipped in great fleets across the sea to feed the vast and hungry population of the imperial capital, so that the bread in the mouths of 1 million Romans came, season after season, from the black mud of the Nile. The wealth still flowed, but now it flowed outward, away from Egypt to Rome, and the Egyptians laboured under the taxes of their new masters as they had laboured under the Persians and the Ptolemies. One more layer of foreign rulers on a land that had almost forgotten what it was to rule itself. And yet, for a long time, the surface of Egyptian life went on much as it always had. The Roman emperors, like the Ptolemies and the Persians and Alexander before them, understood the value of respecting the ancient gods, and so on the temple walls of Egypt the Roman emperors too appear, dressed as pharaohs, in the kilt and the crowns, making offerings to Isis and Horus and Amun in the old way, their Roman names written out inside the royal cartouches in hieroglyphs, so that a traveller today can find, carved on an Egyptian temple in the timeless ancient style, the figure of a Roman emperor presenting incense to the gods of the Nile. 3,000 years of tradition still turning, though the men at the top of it now came from a city on the far side of the sea. The priests still served the temples, the embalmers still wrapped the dead, the flood still rose, the sun still climbed, and the old immensely long rhythm of Egyptian life beat on beneath the foreign surface. But slowly, across the centuries of Roman rule, the old world began at last to fade, not by conquest, but by something gentler and more final, by simply being let go. The temples, no longer supported by a native king whose whole office was to sustain them, grew poorer, and the priesthoods thinner, and the ancient knowledge harder to keep alive. And then, into this weary and ancient land, came a new faith, quietly at first and then like a rising flood, the faith of the Christians, which spread through Egypt with tremendous speed and depth, until within a few centuries the great majority of Egyptians had turned away from the gods their ancestors had worshipped for 3,000 years and given their hearts to the new religion instead. And this was the thing that finally ended the ancient world of Egypt, not the sword of any conqueror, but the turning of the people's own hearts to a new God, so that the old temples fell silent, their offerings ceased, their priests died and were not replaced, their doors were shut, and in time many of them were taken over and made into churches, crosses carved over the old gods, or simply abandoned to the sand and the birds. And here we come to one of the most quietly poignant moments in all of history, a moment that closes the whole 3,000-year story with the softness of a door drawn shut in a sleeping house. Far up the Nile, on the beautiful island temple of the goddess Isis at Philae, in the very last redoubt of the old religion, where a handful of the faithful still clung to the ancient worship long after it had died everywhere else, someone, some priest or pilgrim whose name we will never know, carved into the temple wall one last inscription in the sacred hieroglyphic script, the picture writing that the Egyptians had used for well over 3,000 years, since before the pyramids, since the very dawn of the kingdom. It was carved in the year we would call 394 after the birth of Christ, and it was the last. After that, no one ever carved a hieroglyph again. The knowledge of how to read and write the sacred script, which had been passed down unbroken from scribe to scribe and priest to priest across more than 3 millennia, one of the longest continuous traditions of literacy in the history of the human race, simply came to an end, the last few who knew it dying without teaching it to anyone, until there was no one left in all the world who could read the writing that covered every temple and tomb and monument in Egypt. The temples of Philae were finally closed by imperial order a century and a half later, and with that the old religion of Egypt, which had begun with the first farmers watching the sun rise over the reeds, was over, done, extinguished, after one of the longest lives any human institution has ever had. And a great silence fell over the land of the Pharaohs. The monuments still stood, the pyramids and the temples and the colossi and the painted tombs. More of them, and more magnificent than in any other land on earth, covered from top to bottom in the beautiful, mysterious writing, the little owls and hands and reeds and seated figures marching in their endless columns. But no one could read them any more. The writing had become mere decoration, a lovely meaningless pattern, and the monuments had become, even to the Egyptians who lived among them, the works of a vanished and unknowable people, giants out of a forgotten age. And so Egypt fell asleep, in a manner of speaking, its whole vast history locked away behind a script that no living person could read, its kings and its gods and its stories sealed in silence, waiting, though no one knew it, and no one could have imagined it, for someone, someday, to find the key. For more than 1,000 years, Egypt slept behind its unreadable writing. The land passed under new rulers, first the Eastern Romans of Constantinople, and then, in the 7th century after the birth of Christ, the armies of the new faith of Islam, who conquered Egypt and made it, as it has remained ever since, a land of the Arabic tongue and the Muslim faith, founding near old Memphis the city that would grow into modern Cairo, in whose site the pyramids of Giza still stand. And under all these rulers the ancient monuments endured, too vast and too many to destroy, but utterly mute. Travellers and scholars, Arab and later European, gazed at the pyramids and the Sphinx and the temples, and wondered at them, and spun theories about them, that the pyramids were the granaries where the biblical Joseph had stored grain against the famine, that the hieroglyphs were mystical symbols encoding secret wisdom, each little picture a whole profound idea rather than a mere sound. A wrong guess that would send would be decoders chasing shadows for centuries. The true voice of ancient Egypt, the plain human meaning of all those millions of carved and painted signs, the names of the kings, the prayers of the priests, the accounts of the scribes, the love poems and the letters and the laundry lists, remained locked away, and it seemed it might stay locked away forever. And then, at the very end of the 18th century, the key was found by pure chance in the course of one of history's more improbable adventures. In the year 1798, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte, not yet the emperor he would become, led a great expedition to conquer Egypt, partly for its strategic value against his British enemies, and partly, one suspects, out of sheer romantic ambition to walk where Alexander had walked. And with remarkable foresight he brought with his army not only soldiers, but a small army of scholars and scientists and artists and engineers, more than 150 learned men, charged with studying and measuring and drawing and recording everything in Egypt, ancient and modern. And the vast and beautiful volumes they eventually produced, the description of Egypt, awakened all of Europe to the wonders of the Nile, and touched off a fascination with ancient Egypt that has never since died away. The military expedition itself was a failure, cut off and eventually defeated, Napoleon slipping away home to seize power in France and leave his stranded army to its fate. But in the summer of 1799, while strengthening a fort near a delta town the Europeans called Rosetta, French soldiers digging in the old walls turned up a heavy slab of dark polished stone, broken, covered in writing. And some officer with a good eye saw at once that the writing was in 3 different scripts, 3 bands of text one above another, and understood that this might be something extraordinary. For the bottom band was in Greek, which scholars could read perfectly well, and the top band was in the ancient hieroglyphs, which no one could read at all, and the middle in another Egyptian script, and if, as seemed likely, the 3 texts said the same thing, then here at last was a bridge, a place where the known reached across and touched the unknown, a Greek key that might, with enough patience and genius, be made to unlock the silent picture writing above it. The stone, which we call the Rosetta Stone, was surrendered to the victorious British when the French army capitulated, and carried off to London, where it sits to this day in the British Museum, one of the most visited objects in the world, but casts and copies of its inscription were made and spread among the scholars of Europe, and the great race was on, the race to use the Greek to crack the hieroglyphs, to make ancient Egypt speak again after 1400 years of silence. It was harder than anyone expected, because of that old wrong idea, the belief that each hieroglyph stood for a whole concept rather than a sound, which led the early decoders round and round in circles. But slowly the truth emerged, that the script was a subtle mixture, some signs standing for sounds, like the letters of an alphabet, and some for whole words or ideas, and some for neither exactly but serving to guide the reader, all woven together in a system far cleverer and far more flexible than anyone had guessed. And the man who finally, brilliantly, put it all together was a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, who had been obsessed with Egypt since childhood, who had taught himself a whole shelf of ancient languages in preparation, and who had crucially mastered Coptic, the very last descendant of the ancient Egyptian tongue, still preserved as the liturgical language of Egypt's Christians, so that he alone, perhaps, could hear how the dead language might actually have sounded. Working from the royal names first, the names of foreign rulers like Ptolemy and Cleopatra, and later the emperors, which had to be spelled out phonetically because they were not Egyptian words, he cracked sign after sign, matching sound to picture, building his alphabet of hieroglyphs, and then testing it against the great mass of other inscriptions, and finding, to his mounting excitement, that it worked, that the names of the ancient pharaohs themselves, Rameses, Thutmose, leapt suddenly off the temple walls, readable, pronounceable, alive. The story goes that on the day in the year 1822, when he finally became certain that he had done it, that he had truly broken the code that had defeated the world for centuries, Champollion ran through the streets of Paris to his brother's office, burst in crying that he had found it, that he had got it, and then collapsed on the floor in a dead faint, so overwhelming was the flood of it, and lay insensible for days, felled by the sheer force of understanding, of having reached across 1400 years of silence and heard, at last, the ancient dead begin to speak. And speak they did. Once the door was open, the whole vast library of ancient Egypt, carved on every wall and column and coffin and scrap of papyrus in the land, all of it that had lain mute for so long, began to be read, and the true history of Egypt, the real names and the real dates and the real deeds, everything I have been telling you tonight, all of it, was slowly, patiently, wonderfully recovered, drawn back out of the silence, dusted off, and given again to the world, so that a civilization that had been reduced to a field of beautiful, unreadable monuments became once more a living story, peopled with real kings and real queens and real ordinary men and women whose voices we can hear again across 4,000 and 5,000 years. And that recovery is still going on. Even now, in our own time, archaeologists are still digging in the sand of Egypt and finding new tombs, new temples, new treasures, new inscriptions, still adding to the story, still hearing new voices out of the deep past. So that the tale of ancient Egypt is not a closed book, but an open one, still being written, or rather still being read, page by patient page. And now that the writing can be read again, let us sit for a little while before we come to the very end with the ordinary people of Egypt, the ones who were not kings or queens or conquerors, the farmers and the weavers and the potters and the scribes, the mothers and the children, the countless millions who lived and died along the river across those 3,000 years, and whose quiet lives were the true and lasting body of Egypt, of which the Pharaohs were only the crown. For the writing and the paintings tell us a great deal about them, and it is a gentle and a homely picture, and a good one to drift towards sleep upon. Their world turned entirely upon the river and its flood. The year had 3 seasons, and the Egyptians named them for the river itself. The season of the flood, when the waters rose and covered the fields and there was no farming to be done and the great building projects went forward instead. The season of the growing, when the waters drew back and the seed was cast upon the fresh black mud and the green shoots came up. And the season of the harvest, when the golden grain was cut and threshed and gathered into the granaries, against the year to come. A farmer's life followed this rhythm as surely as breathing, the whole of existence measured out by the rising and falling of the water, and the great fear, the only real fear, was a flood that came too low and left the fields dry and the people hungry, or too high and swept the villages away, and against that fear they set their prayers and their rituals and the whole vast machinery of their faith. They lived in houses of mud brick, cool and thick-walled against the heat, often with a flat roof where the family slept on the hottest nights under the enormous desert stars. They ate bread and drank beer, both made from their grain, so central to life that the 2 words together simply meant food, meant sustenance, meant life itself. And they flavoured their days with onions and garlic and beans and lettuce and cucumbers, with fish from the river and fowl from the marshes, with dates and figs and pomegranates, and with honey, their only sweetness, gathered from hives of clay. They dressed simply, in white linen, light and cool, woven from the flax they grew, and they loved cleanliness and bathing and sweet oils and perfumes against the heat, and they painted their eyes with green and black minerals, not only for beauty but to shield them from the fierce sun and the flies and the eye diseases of the river country, so that the famous painted eyes of the Egyptians, that we think of as pure decoration, were also a kind of medicine. They adored their children, and named them tenderly, and gave them toys, little wooden animals and balls and dolls, and mourned them terribly when they died, as so many did, for life was fragile, and medicine was half prayer and half true skill. They loved music and dancing and feasting, and their tomb paintings, meant to secure these pleasures for ever in the next life, show us the banquets of the living, the guests in their finest linen with cones of scented fat melting sweetly over their wigs, the musicians with their harps and flutes and lutes, the dancers, the heaped tables, the wine, the laughter we cannot hear, but can somehow feel across the millennia. And they worked, endlessly and skillfully, and honoured good work, and the scribes above all. The men who could read and write and reckon held a place of high honour and comfort, and wrote proud little essays urging their sons to study hard and become scribes too. Because a scribe, they pointed out with great practicality, does not have to plough in the mud or sweat in the sun or serve in the army or haul stone, but sits in the cool shade with his brushes and is respected by all. Advice that has a very familiar ring to it even now, and they were, in their quiet way, among the great practical scientists of the ancient world. Their doctors, whose actual medical writings survive on long scrolls of papyrus, could set broken bones and stitch and dress wounds, and knew hundreds of remedies drawn from the plants and minerals around them. And though much of their medicine was mixed with spells and magic, a great deal of it was shrewd and careful observation, and one surviving surgical text goes through injury after injury with a cool clinical eye, describing the hurt, the examination, and the verdict, an ailment I will treat, or an ailment I will fight with, or, most soberly, an ailment for which nothing can be done, an honesty about the limits of their art that any healer would recognise. Their engineers and surveyors could measure and level and align with astonishing accuracy, could reckon the area of a field after the flood had washed away its boundaries, could work out how much grain a granary would hold, and how many men, and how many loaves a building project would need. A whole practical mathematics of everyday life worked out with reeds and knotted ropes and patient calculation. And their astronomers watched the night sky with such attention that they could predict the coming of the flood itself, for they had noticed that the river began to rise each year at just the season when a certain brilliant star, the one we call Sirius, first reappeared in the dawn sky after its weeks of absence, and they built their whole calendar around it, so that the turning of the heavens and the turning of the waters and the turning of their working year were all bound together into a single great wheel. But beneath all of this ordinary sunlit life ran the deep river of their faith, and above all their extraordinary preoccupation with death, which was not, as it can seem to us, a morbid thing, a gloom, but very nearly its opposite, a great and hopeful refusal to accept that death was the end. For the Egyptians believed with their whole hearts that death was not a wall but a doorway, that a person who was properly prepared and properly buried would pass through it into another life, an eternal life, lived in a land very like Egypt but perfected, a field of reeds where the grain grew tall and the river never failed, and one dwelt for ever in the presence of the gods. And so they took enormous care over the passage, and this is the root of all the mummies and the tombs and the treasure. The body had to be preserved because the spirit would need it, and so they developed over the centuries the intricate art of mummification, drying the body with natron salt, wrapping it in many yards of fine linen, laying amulets between the layers to protect it, and setting a beautiful painted mask over the face, so that the spirit could always recognize its own home. And the dead were provided with everything they might need for the journey and the life beyond, with food and furniture and clothing and jewellery and little servant figures who would do their work for them in the next world, and above all, with knowledge, with the spells and the maps and the passwords of the afterlife written on the coffins and the tomb walls and on scrolls of papyrus laid with the body. The great collection of these we call the Book of the Dead, a guidebook for the soul on its dark journey. And at the heart of that journey stood the most beautiful and the most moral idea in all of Egyptian religion, the judgment of the dead, the weighing of the heart. For the Egyptians believed that when a person died and passed into the underworld, they came at last into a great hall, the Hall of the Two Truths, where sat the god of the dead and his 42 assessors, and there the heart of the dead person, which the Egyptians believed to be the seat of the mind and the character and the conscience. The record of everything one had done was taken and placed upon one pan of a great balance, and upon the other pan was placed a single feather, the feather of the goddess of truth and justice and right order, the feather of Mart, that same idea of balance and truth and the right way of things, that had stood at the very centre of Egyptian thought since the beginning of our story. And the heart was weighed against the feather. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, with cruelty and lies and injustice, it sank, and the soul was destroyed, devoured by a waiting monster, and that was the end. But if the heart was light as the feather of truth, if the person had lived justly and kindly and truthfully, had, as the dead declared in the Great Confession, given bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty and clothing to the naked, had not stolen, had not lied, had not caused pain, then the heart balanced the feather exactly, and the soul was declared true of voice, justified, and passed on into the eternal fields to live forever. It is, when you sit with it, a very moving thing to have believed, 4,000 years ago, that in the end what would be weighed was not your wealth or your power or your tomb or your name, but simply your heart measured against the truth, and that a good and gentle life, however humble, would tip the scale toward heaven. The Pharaohs built mountains to be remembered, but the deepest wisdom of their people was that in the last hall it is only the lightness of the heart that counts. And so we come, gently, to the end of it, to the far shore of this long, slow journey, and it is worth pausing here, in the quiet, to ask what remained, what lasted, what all of it was for, this civilization that ran on for 3,000 years, and then fell silent, and then woke again in our own time. Because the honest answer is that almost nothing lasts, and everything does. The kingdom is gone. The pharaohs are gone. Their power vanished so completely that the mightiest of them, the conquerors who made the earth tremble, now lie in glass cases in museums, their thin brown bodies filed past by tourists in shorts, their names known chiefly to schoolchildren and crossword solvers. The great empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the heart of Africa is gone, its provinces long since become other countries with other languages and other gods. The old religion is gone, utterly. Not a single living soul in all the world now prays to Amun or Isis or Osiris, gods who were worshipped with total devotion for longer than the whole span from their end to our own day. The very language is gone as a living tongue, surviving only in the whispered liturgies of a Christian minority and in the patient reconstructions of scholars. All of it, all that power and wealth and faith and certainty, all of it passed away, exactly as the old lament had warned at the collapse of the first great kingdom. The things that never change have changed. And yet the pyramids still stand. 4,500 years after the last block was set in place, the great pyramids of Giza still rise out of the desert at the edge of a great modern city, still enormous, still very nearly perfect, having outlasted every empire and every religion and every language that has risen and fallen in all the centuries since, so old that Cleopatra herself, whom we think of as ancient, lived closer in time to us, to you lying there in the dark, than she did to the building of the Great Pyramid, a thought so strange it is worth turning over slowly, that the queen at the very end of our story looked up at those pyramids as monuments already impossibly, unreachably old, and the Sphinx still crouches before them, still gazing east, still watching the sun come up over the desert every single morning as it has done, without missing one, for 4,500 years. The temple of Karnak still stands, its stone forest of columns still rising into the bright Egyptian air. The colossi of Ramesses still gaze out across the water at Abu Simbel. The golden face of the boy king still smiles its calm smile behind museum glass, and the beautiful painted face of Nefertiti still turns her long neck and her half smile toward us across 3,500 years, and the tomb paintings still glow with their blues and their golds. The banquets and the dancers and the fields of reeds, as fresh as the day they were painted in the dark, meant to be seen by no living eye, and now seen by millions. The stone endured, the images endured, and more than the stone, the ideas endured, quietly, woven so deep into the world that we have forgotten where they came from. When we divide our year into 12 months, when we divide our day into 24 hours, we are using divisions that reach back, in part, to the Egyptians watching the stars rise over the Nile. When we write, we use an alphabet whose distant ancestors were shaped, in part, by workers in the Egyptian mines borrowing the pharaohs' picture signs to spell their own humble words. When we build in stone and column and hall, when we raise obelisks in our own great cities, London and Paris and New York and Rome, each with its ancient Egyptian obelisk standing in a modern square, hauled across the world at enormous cost because we could not bear not to have one, we are still in a way the heirs of the first people who learned to build forever. And when we hope, as most human beings in most ages have hoped, that death is not the end, that something of us continues, that a good and gentle life will somehow, somewhere, be found to have been worth the living, we are thinking a thought that the Egyptians thought first, and thought longest, and carved into the walls of their tombs in the confident expectation of morning. This is the thing to carry with you as you drift off. History does not really disappear. The kingdoms fall, and the languages fade, and the gods grow silent. But the works and the ideas and the hopes of the people who lived sink down and become part of the ground we stand on, part of the water we drink, part of the very shape of our minds. So that we are all of us, in ways we never notice, walking about in a world that ancient Egypt helped to build, thinking thoughts that ancient Egyptians first thought, standing on the shoulders of the small, quiet people who chose, long ago, to stay beside the river and to grow their grain and to hope for the morning. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is truly lost. It only becomes the ground beneath our feet. And now let us go back, one last time, to where we began, to that wide green river moving north through the red desert in the last light of the day. Picture it again, the water so calm that the sky lies down upon it, the reeds standing still along the banks, the tall palms leaning gently toward the water, the heron lifting on wide grey wings and settling again a little further on. Picture the small mud houses on the eastern shore, their walls still warm from the day, the thin threads of smoke rising from the little fires where the evening meal is cooking, the smell of bread and river mud drifting in the cooling air. Picture the dark, rich fields, freshly watered, and beyond them the desert beginning all at once, the green ending and the gold beginning, and far off to the south, catching the very last of the light, the three great shapes of pale stone rising out of the sand against the darkening sky, enormous and silent and perfectly still. We know them now. We know how they came to be there and whose hands raised them, and what they hoped for, all those thousands of years ago. And they are still there tonight, this very night, in the real Egypt, standing in the moonlight under the same stars, exactly as they have stood through every night of all the long story we have told, while empires rose and fell, and the writing was forgotten and remembered again, patient and unhurried, keeping their long watch over the sleeping river. The river is still flowing. It has been flowing for longer than there have been human beings to watch it, and it will go on flowing long after this night is over, brown and patient and heavy with the silt of far-off mountains, moving slowly toward the sea. And you may let it carry you now. There is nothing more you need to do. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to carry, no stone left to lift. The whole long story has been told, from the first small fire on the empty plain to the last queen on her golden couch, and you have walked all the way through it, gently and without hurry, the way you walk through a museum at closing time when the crowds have gone and the lights are low, and now you may lay it all down and rest. Let your breath grow slow. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears, one quiet inch at a time. Let the warm dark gather softly around you, like the linen wrapped with such care and such love around those who hoped so faithfully for the morning. Are you still awake? If you are, there is no need to be, not any longer. And if you are still here, still listening in the quiet, there is another gentle journey waiting for you on the screen, another long slow walk through another far country of the past, ready to begin whenever you wish it, so that you need never lie awake alone in the dark. If you have enjoyed this slow wandering through the story of ancient Egypt, you are welcome to leave a quiet like and to subscribe if you would care to come with me again, but only, as ever, if it brings you some small comfort, and only if it costs you no effort at all. And however you found your way here tonight, from whatever city, in whatever hour of whatever night, know that somewhere out in the great sleepless dark there are others listening with you, drifting off to the same slow voice, carried on the same old river, so that you are not, whatever it feels like, ever truly alone in the small hours. The lamps of Egypt are all long out now. The banquet is over, the music stilled, the guests gone home across 4,000 years, the river runs on in the dark. And there is nothing left for you to do but let your eyes stay closed, and let your breath go slow and deep and easy, and let yourself sink down, very gently, very gently, very gently, into the warm and waiting quiet. Sleep now. Rest now. You have travelled a very long way tonight, all the way down the length of the river of time, and you have earned this stillness. Close your eyes and let it all go soft, and let it all grow dim, and let the river carry you the rest of the way. Good night, sleep deeply, and sweet, sweet dreams.